I would like to say thank you to Stephen and Grace and the PRONI staff in general for really doing a lot of the hard work for organising this conference, because they made the whole task of hosting a conference by the database project very easy, because they did all of the registration, as you know, and promoted it over the past few months, and we're really gratified and a little bit shocked at the number of people who are interested still in the Ulster Plantation. And as Grace will tell you, they had to turn down people because the registration was overbooked through the registration system. So my name is Mary O'Dowd, and I, jointly with Professor Tom O'Connor from Maynooth University, we've overseen the creation of this database that is the focus of this panel, but is also the reason for the conference. And before I introduce the panel members, I just want to say something briefly about the origin and aim of the database. And again, like Stephen, just to thank some people who have been involved in its creation in different ways. And the most important person to be thanked is the late Robert J. Hunter, known to many of you, I'm sure, as Bob Hunter. Because Bob, as William will explain in a few minutes, devoted his most of his academic life, in fact I think all of it, to researching different aspects of the Ulster Plantation. And in his later years, he was particularly interested in identifying the people who came, the material wealth that they brought with them through looking at port books and what was being imported into Ulster. And he wanted to do more than just have a name of a person. He wanted to find out, if he could, a little bit about their background. And sadly, as many of you will know, Bob died prematurely before he could write the book that he was working on in his later years. But following Bob's death, his daughter, Laura Hunter, generously donated a significant sum of money to promote the research agenda of her father. And she gave money, and money came to the Ulster Historical Foundation, and what is relevant for this project, money came to the Royal Irish Academy. We received in the Academy a very large donation from Laura, and we used it to fund a number of research fellowships over, I suppose, the last 7 or 8 years. And in the last 2 years or 2 years and a half, we used it to fund this database, and we had 2 fellows who worked on it, Dr. Robin Usher, who's here today, and Dr. Richard Fitzpatrick, who worked on it initially and really set it up to enable it to be then added to by Robin and maybe others later on. And we're very grateful to the Academy, and particularly to Niamh McCabe, who is here somewhere today. Niamh has come up from Dublin, is here, hiding down at the back. She was instrumental really in finding the funding, particularly for the last year, because it was a cross-border payment from the Academy in Dublin to Queen's in Belfast. And has any of you been involved in any cross-border payment? It sounds easy, but it actually is quite a difficult thing to do, and more complex than you might imagine. So Niamh helped us with that, and she also helped us to find extra funding to keep the project going for 18 months instead of the year that we thought we might only have funding for. So, you know, we really do owe her a lot, and it's good to see her here. Okay, so the aim of the database on the people of the plantation is to develop Bob Hunter's research and to bring together references to as many people as possible from a wide variety of sources, so that we don't just have a name, that we can see maybe where the people were settled or individuals were settled in Ulster, whether they held a particular office or not, if they appeared in some of the surviving court records, or if they appeared in a military muster. So in that way, as Robin will explain, we could build up at least some sort of a profile of the individuals by linking all of these sources together. And this is what Bob was trying to do on paper, and what we're now trying to do in a digital form. The project is, as I say, a collaborative cross-border project. It's based in the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's, and we're very grateful to Professor Peter Gray, who's also here today and will be chairing a session later on. Peter has provided a lot of administrative support for the project, given it a space in the Institute, and again, helped with the funding of it. And most importantly, the Digital Humanities Centre in Maynooth University provided the essential IT support and structure for the database. And as Tom will explain, this sort of piggybacked on a database that they had already developed in the centre, excuse me, where Tom was the director for many years until he retired late last year. And also, as he mentioned, we are very grateful to the IT specialist or senior technical officer, Stavros Angelis, who created with Tom this online system, and sadly has now moved on to at least a warmer climate in Cyprus. So there's a lot of different people and different institutions, as Stephen mentioned, involved in this. Okay, so the speakers now for this panel will explain a bit more about the project. We have first of all Dr. William Roulston, who has been Research Director of the Ulster Historical Foundation since 2006. He's the author of a number of books on aspects of Irish history, with particular focus on the province of Ulster, as many of you probably know, and some are for sale outside. He co-authored most recently with Dr. Tom McNeill, Plantation, Churches, Places of Worship in early 17th century Ulster. And perhaps most importantly, he was an undergraduate in the University of Ulster, where among his teachers was Bob Hunter. William was also, or is also, a member of the advisory committee for the people of the Ulster database, where he has been extremely helpful because he has an encyclopedic knowledge of the Ulster Plantation, possibly only rivaled by Bob himself. And he knows a great deal too about the sources that are here in PRONI. And he will talk about Bob in a few minutes. Second speaker will be Professor Tom O'Connor, who is Professor Emeritus of European History in Maynooth University. And as I mentioned, he's a joint collaborator on the project and was director of the Digital Humanities Centre. And he will talk about the Clericus project that they developed there. Dr. Robin Usher is, as I've mentioned, the postdoctoral fellow who's currently working on the project, and he has made a tremendous contribution by identifying sources and putting them in at amazing speed onto the system. And due to his work in the last year and a half, the database really has expanded in an amazing way. I should say Robin is also a 17th century historian, and he is working on a topic that might be of interest to many people here, which is the building projects of Lord Deputy Sir Arthur Chichester, who many of you will know in association with Carrickfergus here in the north. And Robin will be giving a paper on that aspect of his research in the Institute of Irish Studies next Monday, if anybody is interested in it. And you can attend that in person, or you can also attend it online if you prefer. And I think Peter, wherever he is, I think you just go on to the Institute of Irish Studies website to find the registration details if you're interested in that topic, which does have a direct relevance to the history of Ulster and the plantation. Okay, so we begin with William.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It is great to be speaking to you this morning on this very auspicious occasion, and it is wonderful to see the room so full of people. And I think it's a testament to the continuing fascination that we have with the Ulster Plantation, this most critical period in our recent history, and its ongoing legacy to this day. I was fortunate to have been taught by Bob Hunter at the University of Ulster. I first met Bob in September 1992 when I had enrolled in his course called something like Early Modern Ireland 1534 to 1691, something like that. And he was a fascinating character. First time I'd met him, and he would come into the room and he'd say things like, make sure you fill out this form in case you died and I didn't hear about it. Other examples of his black humour. But he was someone who was much loved by his students. He was exceptionally popular as a lecturer. In fact, you could almost say he was a victim of his own popularity. And in part that contributed in a way to the fact that he didn't produce more, but he still produced an awful lot. But he would lament about, I have 180 students and so only has 6 and things like that. But it was because so many people wanted to sign up to his course because he was such an exceptional lecturer. And I then went on to study his, it was this third year special subject, which was specifically on the plantation of Ulster. It might have been called Ulster Transformed or the Transformation of Ulster. And I did my undergraduate dissertation with Bob as well, and over the years that followed we had many adventures as we drove around northwest Ulster looking at old churches and castles and venturing into places where we maybe shouldn't have been going into and ignoring private keep out signs and all sorts of things like that. But he really was an exceptional individual, and it was my privilege to have known him. And it's my privilege now to say a few words about his contribution to plantation studies, which was immense. Now, Bob moved to Derry, to Magee College in Derry in the early 1960s, and around the same time, having graduated from Trinity College Dublin, he began to undertake studies into the plantation and its impact in Armagh and Cavan. You must remember at that time that the only other comparable study of the Ulster Plantation was that undertaken by T.W. Moody on the London Dairy Plantation. So Bob in many ways was, going into territory that had not been looked at to the same depth that other periods of Irish history had been up to that point. Bob continued his studies in Armagh and Cavan for quite a number of years. Now, for reasons that are still not fully known, when he submitted his thesis, it was not awarded the doctorate that it so richly deserved. Instead, it was awarded an M.Lit. Now, that was a grave injustice. It was fully worthy of being granted doctoral status. And there's no doubt that that did knock Bob in terms of his confidence. He'd been robbed of a PhD for, as I said, reasons that are still not quite clear. As a result, he never did publish his thesis in his lifetime. He did publish various essays arising from it, but he never published his thesis in his lifetime. However, after his death, his daughter, Laura, invited the Ulster Historical Foundation to publish a number of his works. And I'll be talking about those in the course of this presentation. One of those was his thesis. It was published in 2012 as the Ulster Plantation in the counties of Armagh and Cavan, 1608 to 1641. It was an exceptional piece of work. It showed Bob's clear mastery of the sources, his grasp of nuances, his ability to present complex subjects in a clear and easily understood manner. When we did publish his thesis, David Edwards, Dr. David Edwards, wrote a foreword, or an introduction really, to the new edition, or rather not the new edition, but the actual published thesis. And David Edwards did remark that when he was a tutor in Trinity in the late 1980s, he needed something that would tell him more about the impact of the plantation. And so he went to the Trinity Library, and there he got out Bob's thesis. And he noted that, looking back on that from 2012, he had 40 A4 pages of notes taken from that thesis, which helped to inform his own studies into the plantation period. And as for Bob's thesis, David writes that it was a revelation. I was struck by his detailed knowledge of the background of his English, Scottish and Irish protagonists, his careful scrutiny of the series of surveys commissioned by the government immediately before the plantation began, and throughout its subsequent development, his grasp of the various legal and extra-legal mechanisms that underpinned the plantation and how they affected people's lives, from the greatest of the planters to the humblest of the tenants and those that were made landless. And that was Bob's interest. It wasn't simply in the elite of the plantation. He was interested in the experiences of people on the ground, from the wealthiest to the humblest, from those in elite circles to those who were eking out a living precariously. Now, one of the great strengths of the thesis as well was this mapping. And my colleague Andrew Kane is going to talk about plantation maps in the afternoon, or mapping the plantation estates. But Bob had actually mapped out the distribution of lands under the plantation scheme in counties Armagh and Cavan, and got the Armagh slides on the screen at the moment. So he mapped them out as they were originally granted in 1610, and then how that ownership pattern had developed by 1641, the eve of the Rising. And he was very interested in looking at how things developed and in comparing the theory of the plantation with its actual practice. And the two were radically different. So that was Bob's thesis, an excellent study of the plantation in two counties. Now, Bob, I've said, never did publish his great work. He'd always intended to publish a major study on the English in plantation Ulster. Michael Percival Maxwell had published a classic study of the Scots in Ulster in the early 17th century. But Bob wanted to publish the equivalent volume on the English, but it never happened. He did, however, contribute essays to various journals. More particularly, he contributed chapters to books, and he was a great supporter of the geography publications series, the History and Society series, which recently, just last September, was completed for all 32 counties in Ireland with the publication of the Antrim volume. Well, Bob had essays in the Donegal volume, the Derry and London Derry volume, the Tyrone, Armagh and Fermanagh volumes in that series. In fact, he had two essays in the Donegal volume. One on the end of O'Donnell Power in Donegal, and the other on the plantation in Donegal. The volume, the essay in the Tyrone, or the Derry and London Derry volume, was on the Fishmongers' Company estate at Ballykelly. So a detailed study of developments in one individual plantation estate. Now, the Tyrone essay was on the subject that I'm going to pick up this afternoon, on tombstones and style and monumental sculpture in Tyrone in the early 17th century. His Armagh essay was specifically extracted from his thesis about the land grants in Armagh and so on. And in Fermanagh essay was on Sir William Cole, who was a dominant figure in plantation Fermanagh. So Bob was a great supporter of these volumes. and contributed no fewer than 6 essays in total to the series. So he also published a collection of his essays, bringing together his studies. Not every single one of them, but the more substantial of those. He had a great interest in towns in the Ulster Plantation. And Brendan is going to be talking about towns this afternoon. The volume included the History and Society essays and some other works that he had produced. The volume was called Ulster Transformed, Essays on Plantation and Print Culture in Ireland, 1590 to 1641. Edited by Professor John Morrell, a very distinguished scholar. And John writes in his foreword to the book, this volume brings together a selection of his more significant scholarly works. This collection reflects the centrifugal force of plantation Ulster and 2 of its aspects, patterns of settlement, in particular rural and agrarian contexts, and the planting of towns. Both involve a strong sense of material culture and the physicality of the cultural engagement. And Bob was interested in getting out into the countryside and exploring places, actually visiting places. He was supremely in command of the historical sources, documentary sources, and many different archives. But he was also someone who was wanting to get out to view that church ruin, or that old gravestone, or to find where there may have been a bawn at one time, and was there any evidence of that still left. He was keen to get out into the rural environment and find out more. It's interesting that whenever we published the book, we found this photograph. We thought it would be an excellent photograph. I think it was captioned something like Bob Hunter in his natural environment. It's actually from Monaster Boyce. Jonathan Bardens, a very well-known historian, a Dublin man himself, but he spent his career here in the north. And when he reviewed the book, at the very end of his review, he reads, I actually took that photograph. And it was taken on the occasion of the Trinity College History Society outing in 1963. So that was a new bit of information we didn't have before. Now Bob had, as well as his study of the English, he had 2 other great unpublished projects at the time of his death. One was on the Ulster port books. These are port books that survive for the ports of Londonderry, Coleraine, Carrickfergus, and the Lecale ports in County Down, like Strangford and Ardglass. The originals of these papers, when Bob looked at them, I think they were in the Leeds Record Office, are now in the West Yorkshire archives. You keep me right, Brendan, you did this book, is that right? Yeah, good. The West Yorkshire Archive Service and the Temple Newsom manuscripts. And Bob had prepared a transcription of these records, but it was never published. And so Dr. Brendan Scott actually brought it through to fruition in published form. And these books provide an absolutely fascinating insight into material culture at the time of the Ulster Plantation. So goods coming in to the ports and goods going out. So goods going out tended to be agricultural produce, beef, salmon, hides, and items like that. Goods coming in, an amazing range of items, from exotic foodstuffs from Spain to pots and pans to cloth to basics like salt, gunpowder, paper, and so on and so forth. It's an absolutely fascinating insight into the development of local society, consumer society. So there's just an extract from one of the pages just to show you. Now, those are very basic. Usually, sometimes the list can be very extensive. A very, very long list of items that were being brought in on a single ship. And then a merchant would then sell his wares and the items would be distributed among local society. So it really is a really excellent and fascinating study. The other unpublished project that Bob had been working on was a complete transcription of the muster roll of about 1630. This records the names of some 13,000 individuals, men who had mustered, and the weapons, if any, that each one of them possessed. So the original VAT is in the British Library, and again, Bob had prepared a transcription of this, but it was never published in his lifetime. And by a remarkable coincidence, just at the time we were thinking of publishing this, John Johnston, who completed the thesis on Fermanagh, Plantation Fermanagh back in the 1970s, contacted us to say he was working in this as well. So it was a very happy occasion to bring John and Bob's work together. And we were able to publish this book, Men in Arms, the Ulster Settlers about 1630. And it's not simply a listing of the names. What both Bob and John had done is they'd gone to various sources, such as the 1641 depositions, for instance, or the Ulster Inquisitions. And they had tried to match up names in the muster roll with names in other sources. So some of the pages have extensive footnotes, just giving us a little bit more detail about individuals named in the muster roll. Bob was a superb lecturer. I mean, he really did instill, I felt anyway, that he really instilled in his students an understanding of the subject, of the period, of its complexity. I mean, certainly I'm doing what I do now because of Bob Hunter, there's no doubt about that. But he wasn't just about teaching in a university setting. Bob was very much about going out into the local community and running extramural classes and bringing together people from local communities to study aspects of the plantation and how these affected themselves, or how these affected their own areas. So he ran classes in the likes of Omagh, Strabane, Portstewart, Derry, Buncrana, Clogher and Letterkenny. Out of that came a book on Strabane Barony. So people had met over a series of months, I suppose, in the now gone Abercorn Arms Hotel in Strabane, where Bob would have presented them with documentary evidence, such as, for example, a page from original documents. This is from the 1622 report of the plantation for Strabane Barony. And out of that came a publication in 1982, and then that was reprinted in 2012, or 2010 actually, as part of the Hunter project. So Bob was very keen to see people, adult learners, get to grips with the plantation scheme. He was someone who was very committed to expanding an understanding of this period. And although he could scarcely have imagined how his work is now being used, no doubt he would have heartily approved of it. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first visit to PRONI, and I'm very, very happy to be sharing this unique experience with you today. My name is Tom O'Connor, and I am from Maynooth University. And what I'm going to do is briefly give you a peek under the bonnet, under the digital bonnet of the of this project. I think it's important that we have some idea of where it came from, which gives us an idea of what it's about, and perhaps even can predict where it might go in the future. Now, this project, and I think it's one of the ironies of it, is that it began as an effort to record a particular legacy. And that legacy was that of the Roman Catholic clergy in Ireland in the period between basically the Reformation and the French Revolution. And one of the principal sources that we were looking at concerned the student lists of St. Patrick's College in Maynooth, which, as you know, is a seminary, now a university in North Kildare in Leinster, about half an hour or so from Dublin. Now, What we decided to do with the data we had, and I'll explain the various types of data we had, was we wanted to develop a system which didn't just present the data as discrete individual pieces of information, but somehow to identify the links between the various pieces of information and to give people like you, the general public, researchers and anyone interested, the opportunity not just to explore one person in their individuality, but to explore that one person as a gateway to the whole network of institutions, events and other people who are associated with that single individual. And the nice word we have for this, which took me a long time to master, is prosopography. Prosopographical. I'm great fun with those words. So prosopography, simply, prosopon is the Greek for a face. We're beginning with a person's head. What's in it? And more importantly, how that head and what's in it and the body that carries it around is related to the whole network of institutions, people, places and events which make up that person's real lived experience. And in the end, we had 25,000 biographical entries, 4,000 digitized resources, or what historians call sources, where we got the information from, 300 registered dioceses, the Irish ones and ones all over the world, 5,500 unique last names, and relations. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. Now, why did we try to mount this project? We had two requirements, and you can see this happened in 2020. We were looking into COVID and what we were going to be doing for the next indefinite period of epidemical circumstances in the world. So what we wanted was, we wanted to provide a reliable, flexible and accessible digital platform to accommodate large quantities of biographical information on individuals and groups of individuals. The really important thing about this information is that it's bits and bobs. There's no consistency to it. And this was the real challenge of getting a system that was going to permit us to bring this stuff together without deforming it. So we wanted to keep the integrity of the original data, but at the same time link it without misrepresenting it or the network into which it fitted. So the platform was required to cater particularly for the unstructured biographical data, typical of Irish professional and migrant populations. In fact, typical of populations in any era or in any time. Now, we had a pilot project to test this basic set of requirements on, and it was a unique resource or source which was preserved in St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, and that was the records of Maynooth College, as you know, a seminary and university located close to Dublin. You can see I have used this presentation already to speak to people who don't know where the hell Ireland is, but we do in this room, I hope. Now, so first shock, what is the primary source we're looking at? And we had a wonderful source, and this was a set of records which were photographic as well as manuscript. Okay? And they covered a period of more than 200 years, beginning in 1795. Obviously, photography was not only not in its infancy, it was in the pre-in vitro stage in 1795, but we did have student lists. We had a collection then of 124 of these things, which are called class pieces. They are graduation photographs for Maynooth College, from the beginning of photography right up to the day before yesterday. And each class piece consisted of headshots of graduates accompanied by their names and their dioceses of origin. So these are the information points we had, arranged in various formats within rectangular frames. You can see digital people got to work on this. Some of the latter artifacts being of potential significance for art historians. I mean, the very frames of some of these were extraordinary works of art. Now, that was one, so we had the photographic record. Secondly, we had a student list which had been drawn up by a professor called Joey Hamill. we had that in a print version. Now, Joey Hamill did print pages like he wrote letters to his aunt. They were absolutely crowded to the edge with information, and he was constantly sticking pieces of information in. I needn't tell you that for anybody remotely connected with digital humanities, bits added in, out of sequence, out of order, and not according to format, are deadly and are a justification for mass murder, because it drove us absolutely crazy trying to accommodate these details into the system. And you can see that's Joey's version, and believe me, that's a clean one. And we converted them into that. Richard did. Mary mentioned Richard. Now, the digitisation of the new college class pieces was the pilot, okay? We collaborated with historians, you know all that, and archivists, and we developed, just the third point there, a series of work packages. Now, what were the work packages? These are little pieces of work we say, we're going to do this number 1, this number 2, and this number 3. It's sort of a work plan. And with various packages to cover artefact identification, okay? Finding out where our class pieces were. You wouldn't believe how many of them weren't where they should be, and how many we discovered that nobody knew had survived at all. Secondly, their preservation. Lots of these class pieces were in a really bad condition, faded, water damaged, neglected. So this was an important record of where these were at a particular time and what needed to be done about them to preserve them. Data extraction. We couldn't take all the data out of the sources. We had to decide what data are we going to extract and how this was to be ingested into our system, how new pieces of information would enrich what we already had, and these were the various work packages we developed and implemented. Now, technical infrastructure, this is the bit that terrifies me, but I have explanations here of the things that you will need to know. Just the second point there, the technical infrastructure, just to know what the technical infrastructure is. There are 3 parts to it. The first of all is called a server API. Do not worry yourselves about this. It is a thing called an application programming interface, and that is what senior technical officers look at and look after. I have no idea myself if that went wrong or was working. But anyway, it is a crucial part of the whole outfit, and that's why we have technical people who know what it is. Secondly, we had a content management and administrative interface. Now, this is really important because for Robin and for Richard and for the people who are actually working on the project itself, they have to be able to dialogue with the technology, okay? And they also have to be able to dialogue with the technical experts. And that's where those conversations happen. The last thing that we needed was a content delivery public interface. When you click looking for Joe Blogs on the website, that's what that is, where you actually interface and dialogue yourself as a researcher or as an interested person. Now, we also had an Neo4j graph database. Now, what the hell is that? A graph database is a simple and a wonderful thing. It uses the language of graphs, which we all did at school, and happily, as Sue Ellen used to say in Dallas, so often that part of my life is over. But they do intrude into reality every now and again. And what this does is it deals with data as if it was a graphical diagram. Okay? So you have nodes, you have edges, you have points. And what that does is it gives the data enormous flexibility for finding out what is related to what else. Instead of just having one dimension of the data, you have multiple dimensions. And that's basically all we need to know about a graph database. Now, we had to evolve a second thing, which was a data model. Now, again, no need to frighten the horses. All that refers to is developing a way of dealing with the data which is appropriate to the data in question. In other words, we're preserving what's there, but we're relating it in the maximal way possible with all the other data. So we wanted simplicity of the original data. Secondly, we wanted flexibility, because we didn't know where this was going to go or what new data was going to become available. And thirdly, we wanted extensibility. So this was a pilot. We knew that if this was going to be worth its salt at all, it would have to be applicable to a much broader population than the students of St. Patrick's College in Maynooth. So we decided, like most people when they're doing databases which involve human beings, we were going to have 4 primary entities. An entity comes from graphs. Okay. First of all, we're going to have a human being, a person. That was a name. Okay. Secondly, we were going to have a resource. We had found the name somewhere. Where did we find the name? That's this resource or source. Thirdly, there was an entity called organisation. What organisations was the student in Maynooth associated with? They were associated with the college. They were associated with the Archdiocese of Dublin. They were associated with a mission in the Congo. They were associated with a parish in Kerry. Organisation. And lastly, we had events. Life is full of events. We are born. Lots of us are baptised. We are sent to school. We suffer the boredom of boarding schools. We enter the rat race, etc., etc., etc. Events. We had to decide what the important events were, and we had to justify why we chose those events and not other ones. Now, events are all linked one to another. That's what you call a biographical progression. But as you know, all of them are related to a time and to a place. So those were 2 minor entities, time and place, which are interlinkable with the 4 major entities: person, resource, organisation and event. And lastly there in that, all meaningful entity types and relations had to be justified. So when we say that so-and-so was ordained by so-and-so in Maynooth, what did that mean? And does it mean, and then we had to have the inverse relationship, was ordained by. Everything had to link both ways, okay? And this is a picture of the data model. You can see we have our 4 main entities, and then we have the 2 minor entities, and you can see that the temporal one only is linked to events. So we link time, which is crucial in history and in life generally, through events. The event that happens, the person, the resource, and the organisations. Okay, and you can see the number of relationships possible is infinite. And every one of those relationships must be justified by what we call a taxonomy. Another big word like prosopography, which refers to an essential single process in the whole enterprise of justifying why you chose that relationship and what that relationship actually means. We produced this well into COVID in 2020. Most people had survived the pandemic, at least in our team. So what did we get? We had a searchable database, we had an article publication platform, and we had 3 basic tools, which you'll see on the website. We had a heat map. It's a representation of the totality of the data. We had an events timeline for any individual in the database, and we had a network graph, which was that huge map of everything, and which everybody complains about because it's so slow to load. The reason why it's slow to load is because there's so much data in it, and the problem is not with the database, but it's with your machine. And with the state of technology in the world as we know it, I'm glad to issue that disclaimer. Now, we did a second pilot project, I say I'm coming up to the limit, and we decided, okay, we have the pilot, it's worked, let's try it with some new data. So we tried new data and data enrichment, and we took several disparate data sets to see how they were going to fit in. The Diocese of Meath, 16th to the 20th century, we had a list of those people. We worked with the Royal Irish Academy, tested the data model and the structural environment on cognate pieces from other institutions in Ireland. So we took St. Kieran's College in Kilkenny, which is older than Maynooth, 1782 to 1994, and then we decided to go on the continent and try and follow some of these people who went abroad. So we looked at the Paris student lists, 1578 to 1939, Lisbon, 1590 to 1837, and Salamanca, 1592 to 1630. You have no idea of the joy and also the frustration of dealing with these people in their Spanish, their Gaelic Irish, their English, their Flemish, French, etc. incarnations. It was an odyssey. Now, that was the Clericals project. News got round. Mary and I had a conversation and we decided, why not try this on a completely different population, but one that is contemporary with clericals. So the Ulster Foundation, in its generosity, had made monies available, and we decided, let's try a non-clerical, non-academic population, settlers mainly from Scotland and England, who colonised the northern province of Ireland also during the period 1609 to 41. Okay, exactly what we're talking about today. January 2022 to January 2023, we processed over 14,000 individual records, multiple historical sources. Robin's going to talk about these in far more detail and with far greater expertise than I. The clericals data model was modified to cater for the new data, and one of the basic things we did was, instead of having dioceses, which wasn't really going to work for the population we're dealing with, let's do estates, which is a much more meaningful organisation for the data in question, which is what we did. And we demonstrated the capacity to adapt the data model and the structures to this distinctive historical population. So, the Clericals Digital Platform does work, not just for the clergy, not just for the Ulster settlers, but for any early modern or contemporary population. Okay? Quod erat demonstrandum, QED. That was what I was hoping would happen, and largely it has, with more or less difficulties. Now, what are we trying to do at the moment? We're trying to continue with the Hunter, and Robin's going to talk about what's been happening since 2023. We want to continue to ingest new data. Imagine if we could take all the data on the Church of Ireland, the Presbyterian, and all the non-conforming clergy, and put it into the Clericals database, to expand it to include the totality of the clerical state and clerical activity. Would be a wonderful thing to do. All we need is tons of money. Of course, we're collaborating with researchers, research projects working in other historical populations, and technical collaborations, like using our database as training environments for students, developing data ingestion tools, making the process quicker because we use more technology, enhancement of the visualization tools, which are quite basic. We'd love to do more work on them. Development of mapping capacity to facilitate linking layered historical maps. I mean, we've great maps in this country. Wouldn't it be wonderful to link the maps to the people, to the organisations, and also the development and refinement of those bloody taxonomies. In other words, justification for the relationships and why they work and how they extend. There are the two addresses. Please print them. Have them on your headstones and everywhere you can. We need all the publicity we can get. Could I thank you for your wonderful attention and your warm welcome, and I hand you over now, without further ado, to Robin. Thank you.
Okay, morning everyone. It's a great looking audience, delighted to see so many showed up. I'm Robin Usher, the Hunter Research Fellow at Queen's. And anyway, I'm going to get cracking. In 1996, a pair of archaeologists carrying out recording and monitoring work in Newry chanced on a remarkable discovery. While investigating medieval carvings lodged in the walls of a disused bakery, they established that the structure had incorporated the masonry shell of the fortified house built in the 1560s by Sir Nicholas Bagnall. The uncovered remains corresponded closely to a set of elevation and plan drawings roughly contemporary with the house. Eventually, Bagnall's castle, once the centrepiece of a garrison town that Lord Deputy Sidney had described as well planted, would be repaired and became a heritage attraction. This building would have been well known to the British and predominantly Welsh immigrants settled in the town of Newry and its hinterland in the early decades of the 17th century. The recent research of Rhys Morgan has documented the Flintshire dynasts who emerged as the ruling and landowning elite of a region that had previously been a stronghold of the McGuinnesses. We get something of a roll call of these settlers in the will of Marmaduke Whitechurch, written in 1634, which illustrates the family and spatial ties of an ambitious East Ulster newcomer. Sir Edward Trevor, whose Ivy estate was styled Ros Trevor in reference to his wife Rose Usher, features as a legatee, as do several of his blood relatives. Among them is Magdalen, a daughter of Edward's sibling Sir Richard, a soldier and one-time governor of Newry. Magdalen married Arthur Bagnall, direct descendant of the builder of Newry's castle. Thus, by wedding the heir to the Bagnall properties, Magdalen united two great Welsh gentry families. Her son with Arthur lived chiefly in Wales, where he was raised by Magdalen's second husband, another military man who had governed the garrison in Newry. Unfortunately, we don't know where and when Magdalen died. She may have fled Ulster in 1641 and returned to Wales. Before then, she must have witnessed some momentous events, such as the burning of much of Newry in 1600, or the large muster that took place in the shadow at Bagnall's castle in 1603. Her marriage to Arthur Bagnall in 1611 likely took place in the Newry church built by his grandfather. Later, the selection of MPs for the town following its incorporation in 1613 surely involved discussions in the great chamber of Arthur's castellated house, which in late 1641 was sacked by insurgents. But much of the foregoing is supposition. The few facts of Magdalen's life are diffuse and must be assembled from scattergun sources ranging from testamentary documents, fragmentary estate papers, and antiquarian family histories, as well as some modern historical scholarship. Still, she is marginally better served than the other 800 or so women in Plantation Ulster for whom documentation exists. More often than not, their imprint on the record consists of simple mentions in rent rolls or in some judicial proceeding. On a different scale altogether are the British men who settled in the province between 1603 and 1641. Of the estimated 40,000 settlers in Ulster in about 1630, some 26,000 can be accounted for. Precise figures, unfortunately, will always be elusive. However, the purpose of the database is to tabulate the lives that can be accounted for. Tom has discussed the underlying architecture of the platform, outlining how its graph design allows for the fast retrieval of photographical data on individuals whose regional and kinship links are readily indicated in their entries. I'll talk about the sources used and how information from these enabled the entries to build over time. A quick preliminary is necessary. My predecessor, Richard Fitzpatrick, began the work with several massive injusts, beginning with places, working downwards from county to barony to estate to townland as necessary, and sometimes individual domiciles. If you were to search for a barony, for example Dungannon, the servitor and native estates are listed under organisations alongside parishes and so forth. Basic data on the 180 or so estates in the official plantation counties arises in the grants set out in the Jacobean patent rolls as abstracted by George Hill in his invaluable source book that has shaped much of the historiography. Here is Lord Deputy Chichester's holding that comprised the coveted O'Neill seat of Dungannon town, whose castle was rebuilt from Chichester from about 1610, and Hill's summary of the grant is also given to show the kind of source that was used here. Quite a few of the estates tackled by Richard at this early stage are populated by the inhabitants' names as taken from the muster rolls of about 1630 that Robert Hunter had hoped to publish. In a lot of instances, these fencible men are not noticed in other sources. Yet since the rolls brought some 12,000 individuals, they formed the backbone of the database, insofar as this did not primarily concern landholding grandees and their families, but the kinds of tenants who worked the land, constructed the dwellings, and at times even manned some of the juries of assize. The four canonical plantation surveys, Carew, Bodley, Pennar, and the certificates of the 1622 Commission reiterate and develop on much of the information of the original plantation grants. Hill's extensive glosses on Pennar's survey of 1619 brings a lot of additional context extracted from the Chancery inquisitions bunched in the later 1620s. And this extract concerning the Annandale estate in Donegal names the mere Irish who held leases there. And these men are not mere ciphers. One could take Philemi McGilcare, who resurfaces in the estate rentals of the 1630s. The category of events that Tom has alluded to does need perhaps a little more explanation. It designates the appearance of a name in a dated source, such as a rental, a survey, or an inquisition, and therefore ties the individual to a date range. Predictably, the landowning county notables have the greatest number of these. Sir William Cole of Enniskillen, the subject of important research by Bob Hunter, has some 45 events giving a whole chronicle of his career as a county Fermanagh undertaker and much else. Some events are more colourful than others. In the recorded proceedings of the Court of Exchequer, known only from transcriptions by James Ferguson and used by Bob Hunter, Cole and 6 of his servants were summoned for duffing up an assistance to the High Sheriff of the county while attempting to recover seized goods. Hunter's research notes, which further enriched the database, covered the salved chancery bills at the National Archives in Ireland, which have proven highly insightful about property disputes, and not exclusively at the elite level. This case about possession of mills in County Antrim identifies litigants who are otherwise free-floating names associated with the sprawling estates of the Earl of Antrim. Looking at the resulting entry on Margaret Logan, The information in the Chancery Bill was sufficient to show that she resided in the Dunluce portion of the Antrim estate at the village of Bushmills, for which we can almost begin to get a sense of its population and occupational structure. While we're on the Earl of Antrim's patrimony, it's worth looking for a moment at how sources for the tenantries of the Great Estates register in the database. The source used here, a piece by Ian Montgomery in the directory of the Ulster Historical Foundation, is based on the Antrim Estate Archive here at PRONI. It's a massive collection. While entering this data, for a start, the origins and editorial conventions of the source were placed in the description box at the top. Next, navigating to the People tab, the user can then click on any identity. This is Robert Barr. The location of his holdings are indicated, as well as his parish of residence. Other data found in the Chancery Inquisitions enables us to identify his heir, plus a namesake who may in fact be Robert Barr Sr. It's safer to speculate about a duplicate name in the same region than risk conflating multiple identities. This task became a bit onerous when research threw up some 44 James Hamiltons, several of which were relations of the James Hamilton, Viscount Clandeboy, and a little surprisingly, there were a mere 21 John Smiths, but many more if you spell Smith with a Y. Rent rolls became a major focus of data gathering for the second and current phase of the project. Quite a few have been published, and Hunter's research files here have made the database tasks a good deal easier. The richest scene, it appeared, was the series of rent rolls relating to the manors of the livery companies in County Londonderry. Fairly typical was 1622 rental for the Company of Drapers, listing 28 tenants, plus the freeholder Sir Thomas Staples, who also held land on the estates of the Haberdashers, Vintners and Mercers. The Crown confiscation of the Londoners' estate in 1635 had led to the compilation of the so-called Great Parchment Book of 1629, an index of all tenants who occupied the former company manors, now available online. This was part of a digital windfall over the last 15 or so years, including the 1641 depositions and digitally archived manuscript sources from both national and regional collections. Source digitization, sometimes as scans simply uploaded to picture-sharing platforms, has included a growing body of visual resources. Annalee Margie will have a lot more to say about such sources, so I'll just stick to some of the material. Thomas Raven's well-known watercolour maps and views of the Londonderry estates have been digitised by Lambeth Palace Library, enabling their close study. In these, as with this survey of the Fishmonger's Manor or Walworth, the name of the head of each household is written by a schematic drawing of their actual residence. Each map or view joins the database as the aforementioned event. Here is Arthur Britton, who thus becomes a participant in an event in which his identity is noted in the source, namely the map. Additional sources like the Great Parchment Book or another annotated map copied by Hunter lets us know about Britain's spouses and some wider connections. Cartographical evidence for the inhabitants of Ulster's larger towns is somewhat scarce. Lisburn was mapped in about 1625 with some 50 towns named on the plots they held. This document was possibly made for Sir Fulk Conway as an aid in compiling rent rolls. More often, the sources for urban lives, a specialism of Robert Hunter and Raymond Gillespie, are a touch pedestrian, but they can be used creatively. The rentals of the estates of the Archbishops of Armagh, covering the city and its liberties and transcribed in exhausting detail by T.G.F. Pattison, enabled us to populate Armagh in increments over some 4 decades. And this consolidation yielded some interesting findings. We get a catalogue of the children of Archbishop Henry Usher, that carpet-bagging peculator who preferred to squat in Drogheda or Termonfeckin than rebuild his own ruinous cathedral. Matthew, who also resided at his father's Meath estate of Balsoon, did rather well, holding lands in both Armagh City and County Tyrone. Rose Usher, we have met. She was Sir Edward. She wed Sir Edward Trevor and decamped to Newry. While this obvious feathering of nests is vaguely amusing, it is important evidence of internal chain migration triggered by the awarding of landed title to one paterfamilias. Family histories, typically the legacy of leisured 19th century antiquaries, have had some effect on research for the database. They can vary in quality. Bull's Usher Memoirs has some egregious errors, for example, and has been corrected in later scholarship. This account of the savages of the Ards, containing material based on lease books and wills, has much more enduring value, giving 50 new names to the database. Yet even then, we always have to sound a note of caution, as primary source material showed that some personal names had been erroneously merged, and it was no help to me that the preferred first name for men in the Savage dynasty was Roland. Similar issues presented with the otherwise invaluable clerical succession lists created by J.B. Leslie, who was rector of Kilsaran, the parish of Dromiskin in County Louth. Very often Leslie, working with the 1622 visitations and sources like Henry Cotton's Fasti of cathedral personnel, was snared by name spelling variations, resulting in double and sometimes triple entries. But these were often cases of multiple benefices held by a single rector, and corrections had to be made while entering this material. I used the description box for the individual clerics to identify which benefices were held. In 1951, okay, that's Leslie, moving on. 1951 lists of the nascent Presbyterian divines, those who faced censure or deprivation in the 1630s or who settled in the following decade, were entered next, and it was made it made a lot easier data collection based on the memoirs of figures such as Patrick Adair and Andrew Stewart, whose autobiographies heralded a distinctive denominational tradition in live writing. And those have been recently republished by the Ulster Historical Foundation. The Irish Catholic Church has lacked a fasti tradition, and the sources for them are mainly lists based on the registers of continental seminaries. At times, the information in these is vague about the priests' exact places of origins and subsequent movements when below the rank of ordinary or bishop apostolic, though the splicing of multiple lists, as well as contemporary documents such as the Jesuit annual correspondence, did bring clarification. Here is Cornelius Ward references to him in the papers of the Scots Mission, brought definition to a part of the database that risks becoming a catalogue of just free-floating names. Ward must have resided for a time at the revived friary of Bonamargee, which had been supported by the Earl of Antrim, and William Roulston's most recent book, or one of the most recent books, co-authored with Tom McNeill, discusses the history of the building in this period and conveys a very keen sense of place. Life stories, at least as represented in a database like this, may not always be the raw materials of full dress biographies, but work carried out for the project showed that we can get enough glimpses of a population to attempt a pattern analysis or connect previously unconnected data, getting some sense of individuals and families and where they stood in this face-to-face society before the upheavals and displacements of the 1640s. Getting to the present point meant the systematic scouring of sources that varied in length and clarity, not to mention human interest. The incremental tagging of data points such as names, locations and so on allowed information to accumulate within discrete wells. William Dobbin of Carrickfergus, from the family that gave its name to Dobbin's Inn, one of the urban tower houses, is shown here, as is a sort of spider diagram showing his immediate personal connections. The number of sources now stands at 250, up to 200 since the beginning of the current phase of the project. And the work then is on time, above specification, and through a recently redesigned interface is available to all interested users to explore, be those historians or geographers, or community and school groups, or genealogists investigating the roots of any person or individual. I hope that their inquiries will be sped up by the webpage. I hope also that it is a worthy tribute to Robert J. Hunter, who sadly left the stage before his projected study of the English of Plantation Ulster could take shape. The platform, designed by Stavros Angelis of Maynooth University and adapted from the Clericus database mentioned by Tom, has mobilised much of Hunter's research, both published and unpublished, and should stimulate work that builds on his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and thank you so much to Mary and the wider organising team for inviting me along to the conference. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person today. I hope you can see the presentation okay. That's great. Well, I'm very honoured to be able to speak today about research that I've really been conducting on the maps of the plantations for the last 25 years at this stage, which sounds like a lifetime, and I suppose it is, but it has meant that I've been really focusing in on trying to understand the wider collections of maps that are available for the whole country during those decades. And my paper, as I say, is based on this research, When I would have begun this research, I suppose 25 years ago now, maps would have been quite underutilised really as a tool in historical research, particularly for the plantation period. There had only been a handful of scholars who had worked on them, particularly led by Professor John Andrews, who would have interrogated maps in their own right rather than just being something that accompanied sort of text or mere illustrations. And what's interesting is that he would have looked at maps as tools of administration and also planning within the wider English and later, of course, British settlement in Ireland. In recent years, however, I'm glad to see that historians and geographers have really begun to look at them more widely and to very much view them as part of the apparatus of the state in the early modern period. And that change of scholarly direction really coincided with what we describe in geography as a cultural turn, particularly in the study of cartography, when cartographic historians like J.B. Hardy began to ask us to question maps and what we were actually seeing in maps, to see them not just as wayfinding devices, but as objects of control and power in their own right. And through that viewpoint, they began to create a framework for maps that spoke really to the rhetoric and practice of early modern governance in Ireland, particularly in terms of exploration and colonial mapping in general. Since that, historians and historical geographers like Willie Smith in his seminal work, Map-Making Landscapes in Memory, argued that in the Irish context, and I quote, the map became the eye of the state, the imperial eye, which ranged over landscapes and peoples as an instrument of both survey and surveillance, and if necessary as an instrument of colony. So today I want to introduce a little bit more about these maps, particularly those for the Ulster Plantation, to show how they were a fundamental part of that plantation in the province. And it will introduce just a selection of maps so you can see the range of those for the various phases of plantation, particularly the reconnaissance, subjugation, preparing for plantation, plantation itself, and then the urban mapping and the estates. So to really begin then, I want to look in particular at the maps as very much cartographic representations. And in the first instance, I suppose, one of the ways that I like to look at this is to consider what did we know about cartography in Ireland in the pre-plantation period. So Englishmen, what did they know of Ireland? And the answer really is not a lot. They were reliant on cartographic representations that were based on the likes of Ptolemy's work in particular. And by the 1520s, things didn't look too much different than Ptolemy's work, with the only early manuscript map of Ireland showing what could be described as a very rudimentary geography. So this would of course have been Ulster to the right of this map, so that you can see they really didn't have that much great geographical knowledge, or indeed anything like a map that you or I would understand today. So geographical knowledge of Ireland was based entirely on written reports that the administrators would have received that described the landscapes through which maybe armies were passing, or indeed surveyors were passing, and they would have introduced them to the Gaelic lordships of Ireland. So it meant that as early as the mid-1540s, when plantation really begins in earnest in Ireland, there were very little pictorial representations of the country as a whole. But by the 1540s, maps were really emerging as part of England's administrative armoury in Ireland. And as such, those maps began to play a role in all aspects of administration, from reconnaissance right through. And that interest has borne significant fruit, as we will see, hopefully, as we go through the paper today. The upsurge, of course, happened very much at a point in time when England's interaction with Ireland began to increase and geographical thinking began to pervade every level of governance in Ireland. It's not unsymbolic really that images of Queen Elizabeth I, for example, began to show her standing on maps around the period of time when exploration, particularly in the early modern world, was increasing. And by the 1560s, for example, here in Ireland, Ulster was of course in the spotlight with Jane O'Neill's rebellion, and by the 1570s, Munster began to be in the spotlight with rebellion there also, and they began to realise that they knew very little about the Irish landscape, particularly the inhospitable landscape of Ulster and Munster. So calls were made by Queen Elizabeth herself as early as 1567 for plats of the province to be sent to her, and early cartographers like Robert Lythe began arriving in the province by the end of the 1570s. That interest was also then increased further by administrators in general. Key statesmen like William Cecil, Lord Burghley, the Queen's Lord Treasurer, and later his son Robert Cecil, who became Secretary of State in his own right under James I, would have often used maps to aid them in their day-to-day administration in Ireland. Lord Burghley's handwriting, for example, which is very obvious, can be seen right across maps of Ireland in the late 16th century. And we know that he too also drew maps of Ireland almost as aid memoirs. This one accompanies some correspondence that he happened to be reading on a given day. It doesn't look like a map that you or I might know today, but you can see he's clearly delineating the likes of Munster here at the bottom and Ulster here at the top, with some of the locations that he was reading about in his correspondence placed around the country. So geographical thinking was beginning to expand. In the Irish context, of course, by the 1560s, maps of Ireland were becoming a little bit more commonplace, with the first maps of Ireland being produced by mapmakers like John Gough. Gough's map, for example, which has been reproduced many times, saw Ireland very much in a familiar stance on its side, with north at the right. Ulster, as you can see, was very little known by the 1560s, with the emphasis really being on the east coast rather than on the west coast, showing really where Englishmen would have had their most interaction with up until that point. Of course, that was to change by the mid-1560s with Shane O'Neill's rebellion, when much of Ulster began to be explored by Englishmen for the first time. So when we think then about mapping in Ulster, we can very much look at the idea that maps of Ulster begin to increase significantly from the 1570s. And to give you an idea of what types of material is out there, we know that it has left behind a significant legacy of maps. We have about 400 surviving maps now for the Ulster Plantation period, and more come to light all the time. They're in major locations across Britain and Ireland, the likes of the National Library, Trinity College, and also the British Library, but they're also in smaller locations like the Guildhall Library, Drapers Hall in London, and some have even ended up in private hands, where I found one in an ensuite bathroom. So they really are spread quite widely across both Ireland and Britain. In the first instance, as I said, we can look at why these maps were made and the phases in which they were made. And it's quite interesting that we can broadly see how maps begin to change over time as England's role in the province of Ulster also begins to change. And as I've noted before in my writing, there are broadly about 6 phases of map making across from the 1570s onwards. So if we look at reconnaissance mapping, for example, amongst the most famous of the maps would be this one, which is a Francis Jobson map of Ulster from the 1590s. By 1590, an entry in the Treasurer's account was noting that he was appointed to, and I quote, take the plot of the countries of Tyrone, both the Clandeboys, the Route, and other parts of the province of Ulster. Jobson's resulting provincial maps are crucial pieces of evidence in our understanding really of how the relationship with the province was beginning to change at the end of the 16th century. As the 9 Years' War was erupting, for example, Jobson was providing representations of not just the Gaelic lordships, which are marked across the map. You can see here Maguire and Fermanagh very clearly, but also of what was going to be the new emerging geography of English counties. And all along the sides of the map here, you can see an inscription that delineates the landscape of each county in the province of Ulster. You can also see, for example, that they were beginning to think around the types of buildings that would be useful in a plantation, with the inclusion in particular of military buildings in red across the province, like these ones here along what would be the River Foyle. And then in turn, we can also see how the idea and the concept of how England was beginning to claim this landscape as part of their English lands was pervasive, with the beginning of the inclusion of royal seals on maps of the province. So Jobson really would have given English officialdom their first insight into that wider geographical expanse of the province and really helped administrators to sort of situate the locations that they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. By, of course, the 1590s and the early 1600s, that relationship was changing, particularly when war was erupting in the province. And we know at the height of the 9 Years' War in particular, that English authorities would have sent map makers like Richard Bartlett into the province in the retinue of Lord Mountjoy's army to understand more about the military landscape of the province. From this particular point in time, we have a plethora of military maps that cover everything from camp plans to fortification plans to the type of map that's in front of us here, which is very much a provincial military map and a regional military map. This one, of course, drawn by Bartlett, is an important map because it shows us, for example, the natural and man-made landscape that would have been important to armies at that time. And in particular, we know that the landscape of the province formed a very important part of the kind of routeways into Ulster in particular, with the Gap of the North here, of course, being fundamental to where English armies would have passed during the 9 Years' War. We also know, of course, that quite a number of buildings would have been included in red on this map, which then in turn became key English fortifications. And again, Bartlett even showcased this landscape even further by his production of multiple fortification plans like this one of the Moray Pass and Castle. Again, a very fundamental part of that entryway into the province of Ulster. So that by the early 17th century, that sort of military landscape and the use of maps as part of that military landscape and the subjugation of the province was becoming more important. So of course, we all know that in 1607, the flight of the Earls ensured that the lands of Ulster became forfeit to the Crown. And at that point in time, you now had a situation where English administrators effectively were becoming the masters of lands that they didn't necessarily know that much about. And so they began to commission surveys. The first survey was a written survey in 1608 that wasn't very successful, so that by 1609 they were engaging with map makers to begin a process of mapping the province of Ulster. And that became what we now know today as the Bodley survey. Bodley, for example, and the team that he worked amongst were given the instruction that they were to produce maps so that readily and by the eye known bounds of every country might be discerned, to include the church land and the temporal land, and to then also show the shares for the undertakers being laid out. So with the shares to the undertakers being laid out, maps effectively at this point in time become part of the apparatus that carved up the province of Ulster into the plantation estates and became a visual record of what the plans for plantation actually were. For example, we now have 28 of these maps surviving. There are a number of tracings of maps also surviving for County Donegal in the library in Trinity College in Dublin, but these ones are in the National Archives in London. They produced these maps, 28 of these maps, on a barony basis, which of course became effectively the precinct for the plantation. And then in turn, the Irish townlands became the proportions. The interesting thing about these maps is that, of course, they fundamentally show the viability of landscape. And so you can see, for example, the inclusion of everything from rivers to mountains to bogs to forestry, all of which, of course, would have been important for settlers coming to Ulster to understand where their lands were and what they could potentially use. They also included key settlements. So on the barony of Armagh, for example, you can see where I have it surrounded there, where you have the town of Armagh, and also the likes of Charlemont Fort, which of course was very much part of that existing English landscape in the province. Again, this particular set of maps was then sent back to the English government. We have the correspondence in 1610. And those maps, as they say, besides the county of Derry, were newly bound up into 6 books for His Majesty's view. Interestingly, they're accompanied by this map, which is an overview map, which is now in Hatfield House, which, although it's quite faded here, actually shows the outline of every barony in the province of Ulster. So it's almost like the master plan for smaller maps, which were then produced on the small scale. By 1610, things were moving apace, and maps then became very much part and parcel of the understanding of how that landscape was changing, particularly with the production of maps like these, which showed the sheeted counties of the province of Ulster. This particular map by John Norden, now in the British Library, for example, shows each and every individual proportion, and it actually includes the name of the undertaker or the servitor or the deserving native who achieved that land, the size of their estate, and then in turn the lands that they were receiving as part of that estate. So very much giving a visual representation to where people were going to be located in plantation. As time progresses, of course, maps begin to record other types of plantation, like the Londonderry plantation. And a second key element focused, for example, from this period on the estates of the London companies in the former County Coleraine. The engagement, of course, of the London companies gave rise to very much the formal breakup of that area into 12 proportions, representing the holdings of the 12 great livery companies of the city. And during their formative years, many individual livery companies began to request surveys of their lands. This particular set of maps, which is at Draper's Hall, seems to have been a survey commissioned by Sir Thomas Phillip. And Sir Thomas Phillip had estates in the county of Coleraine prior to the London companies achieving their lands, and was somewhat disgruntled by the fact that he was forced into what he considered to be the lesser lands around Limavady. But what came from that commission was a beautiful set of maps during the period of time in which he was appointed as a commissioner in 1622. The survey contains the master map, which I showed a few seconds ago, but then in turn also a map of each individual company's lands, along with a map of each individual company's buildings on their estate. So it gives a very visual representation of how the London companies were actually beginning to build towns within the plantation, or villages within the plantation. And you can see here, for example, in the ironmonger's proportion, that Sir George Canning's house is very much dominant in the map, surrounded by what could be considered that very traditional English exoskeleton wood structure housing, but then in turn cabins, which were possibly still those being used by Scottish or Irish settlers. So these maps are very much part of that visual apparatus of understanding what building and architecture began to look like within the plantation as well. Again, part of that kind of phase of plantation planning was also the development of towns and urban areas. And amongst the kind of cities and towns that were very much focused upon were the likes of Londonderry or Derry and Coleraine. And we know that under the plans for plantation, 25 new corporate towns were actually planned. So as early as 1611, for example, Thomas Raven, who becomes a central and key mapmaker in the Londonderry plantation, was producing a plan of what would be the new city at Derry. And this particular plan, you can see, doesn't look necessarily like the walled city we know today, because it was actually only enclosed on 3 sides rather than on the 4 sides. But you can see the positioning of the city is very much that which is in evidence there today. And you can see how, for example, the walls were being developed and how that kind of gridiron street pattern was fundamentally imprinted on the landscape. By 1619, in Pinner's survey, again, you get a much more detailed representation of the emerging city. And you can see, for example, in this particular plan that it is now actually enclosed on 4 sides. You can see how the quays are beginning to be operational, bringing commercial activity to the region, and how, for example, the beginnings of the requirements for housing in the city were beginning to be developed along the roads and the routeways through to what today would be the Diamond. By 1622, Thomas Raven's maps for the Phillips survey again was giving an even more detailed view. You can see that by then more housing had been built, the beginning of the churches that were in place, some garrison buildings were in place, and you can even see the likes of lime kilns at the top of the map there, showing how industrial function was beginning to emerge. Similarly, estate development begins to emerge at the end phase of plantation, when many of the central and large landowners began to commission their own sets of maps. So for example, this particular set of maps belongs to the Clandeboy estates and was produced in 1625 and 1626, again by Thomas Raven. It's an interesting period on the estate because it's a period when a dispute was ongoing between Lord Montgomery and Clandeboy about the boundary of their estate. So as a result, this focus of the survey is very much on the boundaries within the estate and the land grants on each of the lands. The particular survey contains 75 maps, so a very, very detailed survey, and again includes even more detailed descriptions of some of the landscape, the small rural villages that were beginning to emerge, like Killilay. The house of Killilay, for example, is included there, and even the likes of parkland on the estate. There's no real physical commentary on this map, other than a description merely of the landscape. So, as you can see, across the lifetime of the mapping of the Ulster Plantation, we can really adjudge that the Ulster Plantation was the most extensively surveyed of all of the plantations in Ireland. As English officials became more involved with the province, mapping underwent significant change, reflecting the changing needs and roles of the government in the province right across the spectrum of plantation years. And as the government's relationship with Ulster continued to change, it moved through all of those phases, from reconnaissance right through to preparing for plantation, and then of course to the landowners themselves producing their own estate maps of plantation. So in a modern appraisal, when you look across the catalogue of maps, which I had the good fortune to do, we can really divide them up into those types of categories. Of course, people at the time wouldn't have seen the entire corpus of what was there, but they really do reflect an attempt to record changing landscape throughout the decades of plantation, very much as the landscape of the province moved from that kind of native Gaelic footprint right through to the ideal of the English ordered and planned estates. So in many instances, maps themselves became very much the agents of control that Willie Smith talks about, creating that blueprint for the future development of the province along English lines. And in that regard, the maps effectively offer us a window onto the settlement of Ulster, recording key features of the plantation, including everything from architecture to land boundary changes to urban and estate development, and even right down to the people, the settlers on the estate. Thank you very much.
So if I can introduce to you our second speaker in the panel, Andrew Kane. Andrew works as a research consultant with the Ulster Historical Foundation, and his voice is well known in his home town of Coleraine and along the north coast, where he's been actively involved for many years in family history research. Just in 2024, he published with the foundation the Townland Atlas of Ulster, by which all over 16,000 townlands in the province were included. Today he will talk to us about mapping the Ulster Plantation estates. Andrew.
Okay, well thank you very much, Paddy, and good afternoon everyone. Today I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experience of creating the Townland Atlas of Ulster in relation to the really try to recreate the plantation estates and work forward from there. So I'm going to deal with how the estates were described before the plantation, what mapping was available at its outset, very much along the same lines as Annalee has already covered, the maps created during the plantation and in its immediate aftermath, noting the dramatic improvement in surveying techniques as the 17th century progressed, and then finally how gaps in the surviving mapping can be reconstructed. Okay, so prior to the plantation, surveying was done by inquisition, where local jurors confirmed the boundaries of a property, including the names of the smaller denominations making up the estates, and these are what we would call townlands. Here we have an extract from the County Antrim Inquisition of 1605, and up here we can see that it describes the Killilay estate of Níl O'Goneill. So it describes the boundaries and then it goes on to list 12 of the 20 townlands that fall within that area, followed by the remark, with others whose names, on account of the long devastation of the country, the jurors cannot learn. So this shows both the strength and weakness of the Inquisition method used alone, in that you know exactly what they're talking about because of the boundaries, but what's inside is very much up to people's knowledge, and they don't really seem to have gone into too much bother to find out. So, and the scant mapping done at the time is insufficient to identify the precise boundaries on the ground. So in 1548, Walter Cowley was appointed the first Surveyor General of Ireland. And although this was a very progressive sounding appointment, it did not result in a great flurry of official or accurate map making. His role consisted mainly of determining the financial value of estates, and he was specifically excluded from a role in surveying forfeited land, which remained under the direct control of the Lord Deputy. This map you've seen already this afternoon. It's the Francis Jobson map of around 1590, showing what really prevailed before the plantation. Large estates are marked and there's boundaries shown and names and so on, but scale and detail are markedly absent. Jobson, in his correspondence, refers to various estates outside Ulster which he provided maps for, but none, to my knowledge, none of these survive. But the game was changed totally with the flight of the Earls and the subsequent forfeiture of 6 whole counties in Western Ulster, making a huge area available for redistribution by the Crown. The Surveyor General at this time was William Parsons, who held the post from 1602 right up to 1641, so the whole plantation period up to the 1641 rebellion. His reputation, unfortunately, with professional map makers was very poor indeed. Thomas Raven was scathing of him. And it was left to the military men like Sir Josiah Bodley and Nicholas Pinner to perform the role of surveyor as we would understand it in the distribution of estates under the plantation. Royal Commissioners visited Ulster from Dublin in 1609, and their instructions were to prepare, make an accurate survey or measurement of the arable lands in each county, that the names and situations of each Ballyboe, Tate, Quarter and Pole should be preserved and expressed on carefully prepared maps, as well as the name of every lake, river, brook, wood, fort, bog and any other landmark throughout the said 6 counties. The Commissioners were also required to identify separate church lands and designate the precincts, baronies in each county to the several intended occupants, and marking off the arable land in proportions to suit planters. These proportions of 1, 1.5 or 2,000 acres are the plantation estates which survived in one form or another right up to the Land Purchase Acts of the 20th century. Now this mammoth task was commenced by the Commissioners at Armagh Assizes on the 8th of August 1609, and they finished their work at Cavan Assizes on the 30th of September the same year. Less than 2 months to measure, survey and combine into equally valuable estates the entirety of 6 complete counties. Clearly a lot of preparatory work was done before they arrived, and you've already heard about the maps of Josiah Bodley in that regard. But a large part of the work was simply appropriating the status quo. The unit, now known as a townland and described in the instructions, Bodley's instructions there as the Ballyboe, Tate, Quarter or Pole, were already integral to Irish landholding. As such, units were ubiquitous. They were assumed to be roughly equal, approximately equivalent to half an English ploughland, and estimated to include 60 acres of arable land. This gross assumption on the basis of acreage is the basis of acreage is given in the plantation grants and even 40 years later in the civil survey. So you can see here how the adoptions of the Gaelic system did not end with taking the townland features. The lands of Gaelic lords are the estates that we see mapped on the Elizabethan era maps, like the Jobson map. But these were then distributed among his chief followers as Ballybeatas, a unit of more or less 16 townlands. So on the basis of an estimated 60 acres per townland, the Ballybeta therefore consisted of 960 or approximately 1,000 arable acres. As the small proportion granted under the plantation was to be 1,000 acres, civil servants drawing up these estates had basically a ready-made template for their work, and the extent to which the new proportions matched the existing Ballybetas, whose names they often adopted, is a fascinating subject for further research. This is the bodily map for Lochensholen barony, which I have, in my course of my work for producing my atlas, I then had this as a Queen's copy, and I had put in the modern spelling of each townland name. So you can see that we've already heard how many maps survived. Armagh, Tyrone, Donegal and Fermanagh. Armagh, Tyrone, Fermanagh and Cavan have all their maps, barony maps, survive. For Donegal, there are no maps other than sketches, and for Londonderry, we simply have Lochensholen, this barony, as it was originally part of County Tyrone. The fieldwork was recorded in books without measurement, and the maps completed elsewhere. So the basic assumption that each ballyboe or townland was equal size is demonstrably wrong, but is a useful rule of thumb for a royal commission in a hurry. Some of the bodily maps are great. This one is very good. You can see how it lines up with the modern townlands practically one-to-one. Very occasionally there are further combinations or splits, but practically one-to-one there. This map is practically useless for linking grants to modern place names. But as the unit used is much larger, it's often described in papers as a quarter, but it seems to be much larger than a quarter would be in any of the other counties, and is no longer in use. We do see some correlation to this for in the books of survey and distribution, which we'll discuss later, where specific townlands are allocated to each quarter, but only for the barony of Macrostepina, and not, unfortunately, for Knocknany or the other counties. Armagh, which Annalee also showed you, is an absolute classic. It did my head in, because it's upside down and back to front. You can see when I started to write in the names of the townlands, I go, how can that be to the side of this one below? It just doesn't make any sense. Well seen, it was done in an office from somebody who couldn't understand somebody else's handwriting. These maps, though, are essential in understanding the plantation grants, because it's the names on these maps that are used in the grants, which happily collected together and preserved in George Hill's plantation in Ulster. As you can see here, this is one of the County Tyrone grants to Edward Kingswell, and it lists all the ballyboes, and then it gives a total of 1,000 acres, and it refers to these ballyboes containing 60 acres each, and so on, and so forth. In his magisterial work, Plantation Acres, Professor Andrews refers to the poor quality of the bodily maps, noting in particular that the barony maps don't even fit together. And this is highlighted in the case of Ballycolway. It's a Ballybeta or quarter in Knocknany barony, which we saw earlier, on its boundary with Tully Hall barony in County Cavan. It's not included in the maps of either barony, and so was not included in the plantation grants. So, and subsequently Lady Maguire was able to successfully petition the Crown for the rents of this land on the basis of a pre-Flight of the Earls grant, which is really amazing whenever we think about how we view the plantation. But they just said, oh, it hasn't been granted to anybody else, it must still belong to the Maguires. So, and indeed the work done by the commissioners at Coleraine Assizes, which took over a week or 10 days at the end of August, was totally wasted, as that county was not even included in the conventional plantation scheme, and instead was divided into the 12 estates that Annalee has already talked about. Now, this was done in 1610. It was the City of London signed an agreement with the Privy Council to take on the Londonderry plantation. But although it was not until 1613 that a royal charter incorporated the Irish Society which administered that particular plantation and created the new county of Londonderry from the old County Coleraine and neighbouring chunks of Antrim, Tyrone and Donegal. The new county consisted of much larger estates than the other planted areas, and a detailed valuation of each townland was undertaken to ensure that each estate was of exactly equal value. And you can see here that the surveyors for the London companies have actually gone out at each townland and they have given a valuation. Now the valuation is at 4 pence in the pound and so on, giving every estate a nominal annual value of £138.15, although the number of townlands varies from 27 on the Clothworkers estate and the plains outside Coleraine to 65 townlands in the Skinners estate in the uplands of the Sperrins. So if that had been under the ordinary scheme, those would have just been considered equivalent townlands. The individual companies' guilds then produced maps of their own estates, and several of them show the Ballybeatas as well as the townlands, such as this one of the Ironmonger's estate of Manor of Lizard. The Londoners had engaged Thomas Raven to survey their lands, but when Thomas Phillips came in dispute with the London companies, he engaged Richard Hadser to produce alternative maps of each state in the 1620s as part of that dispute, and these are preserved in the volume Londonderry and the London Companies 1609 to 1629, which was published by PRONI back in 1928. I can just, although these maps do not really show very clearly the outlines, you couldn't walk the boundaries of each of those townlands based on that map. Again, you can see there's one name, modern and old, they're easily identifiable, but the large green type are the Ballybeatas. You can see how they are not even all in one homogeneous group, but they can have wee outliers as well. Okay, other estate owners also mapped their estates. This is the Hadser map, again showing names but no boundaries or whatever. That is the Grocers Company outside Derry City. Okay. Other estate owners have mapped their estates with varying degrees of accuracy, and these remain an important source of detail for an admittedly small proportion of estates. The major upheavals of 1641 and the subsequent Cromwellian Wars led to a further flurry of official surveying. This is the civil survey conducted by commissioners appointed in each county to determine and record the possessions of the proprietors of land as of the 23rd of October 1641. So again, you can see here how they have assumed the 60 acres per townland, but they've got all the names and they've done some sort of apportionment between arable and pasture and so on. But it's hardly what you would call an accurate survey. The commissioners were to be revenue officials and or other able and knowing men of the country, and distinct local juries were empanelled in each barony to assist the commissioners in the way the inquisitions were done. They were to find out and inquire into every particular, but only where necessary to view and tread the metes and bounds of the premises. Needless to say, I can't imagine they did it very much. So, while the survey has acreages and values, these are no more than estimates or the current rental, and no maps were produced with this survey. But it is important. It only survives for the counties of Tyrone, Donegal and Londonderry, but where it does survive, at least it gives us a full list. You can say, here are all the townlands that were identified in that county. So if we don't know who owned one from other sources, that's a gap we have to fill. And unfortunately, it's only for 3 of the 6 planted counties. The quantity of surveying takes a massive leap forward here with the appointment of Sir William Petty to complete the Down survey. Petty had come to Ireland as a physician, but he soon came into dispute with the Surveyor General Benjamin Worsley over the conduct of the detailed survey of forfeited and church lands identified in the civil survey reports. Petty took over this work himself and produced maps and acreages that I think are remarkable in their quality and relative accuracy, not only for their own time, but comparable to anything before the establishment of the Ordnance Survey in the 1820s. Now, although not within the official plantation, the estates of the Earl of Antrim, which covered 6 whole baronies of northern County Antrim, clearly demonstrate the problem that denominations recorded in the Down Survey, and indeed all of the 17th century sources, are not always precisely aligned with the townlands recognised by the Ordnance Survey. And you can see here I have the green lines represent the boundaries in the Down Survey map, and the black lines is where they are the ones we know today. Basically, a lot of these, particularly upland areas, are shown by quarter, maybe 3 townlands, or even some of them are just, we can see townlands that have been clearly divided into upper and lower subsequently. But generally speaking, it gives us an idea of what's covered in the documents. So if you're looking for what happened in take a townland there, Turnavennog in Lochgeel, you know that it's part of Ballynock quarter, simply from this map, and you can look up Ballynock as your reference for that townland. Okay, the range of descriptive words for places now identified as townlands, that's not particularly clear on that, shows just that these sub-denominations existed at the time, but were simply not recorded unless they were required. So we can't assume that just because a place is not named on these maps, that it wasn't called by that name at that time, and you can often find reference to it in leases and rentals and so on. And although the surveyors only map the potentially forfeit and church lands, they are accurate enough to allow us to determine the limits of estates not subject to the Cromwellian depredations, and can determine which subsequent subdivisions fall within certain estates and which do not. And the description of the boundaries also pinpoint the extent of individual land holdings. These, the Down Survey maps are available in PRONI under D of 597. So the final piece of the jigsaw is provided by the books. This is about the different names. You can see here that quarter, 20 acres, half town, so on, townland and town and lands are all used for things that we would identify as one townland today, and they vary enormously in size from those mid-century sources. So hopefully you've been upstairs and were able to see a copy of the books of Survey and Distribution upstairs. There's a County Down volume open, and they really are brilliant. They were compiled after the restoration of Charles II in 1660, and an Annesley copy of this criminally underused source is held in PRONI, and you can see one of the volumes. They are also can be consulted readily under microfilm MIC 532. But it draws together the ownership information from the Civil Survey, the map references and accurate acreages from the Down Survey, and best of all, it actually covers 8.5 of the 9 counties of Ulster. Apologies to anyone from Fermanagh, because you contain the half county that is missing. So, but it also states who own each land unit before, not under the short-term Cromwellian allocation to soldiers and adventurers, but rather the restoration settlement following the deliberations of the Court of Claims. So, quickly finish off here. No one document can give us all the information we need to map the plantation estates. But the sheer variety of 17th century sources, and I used all of these sources to help map my estates in my atlas. The sheer variety allows us to complete the picture by the interplay between them. This is the finished product. This is part of the plantation estates map for the barony of Coleraine, and it shows the complex network of how estates are not all necessarily in one place. They're interspersed with other estates and native lands and church lands and so on. And whenever you take into account the freeholds within each London manor, the situation becomes even more interesting and much, much more complicated than you would assume. Again, in my atlas, I have sought to, for each of 400 estates across Ulster, I have referenced them to all those sources, so you can look up directly which folio or page or whatever, or what the name is, because sometimes it's very difficult to use sources like the muster rolls, because you don't know what it's called, that estate's called in the muster roll thing. So I think that's me. I'm sorry I had to sort of look through this very quickly because Annalie kept talking about all the things I was going to talk about. I should have gone first.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Our next speaker, thank you very much, Andrew. Our next speaker, Dr. Dave Heffernan, is an historian of Tudor and early Stuart Ireland. He's published numerous books, including a recent edition with the Irish Manuscripts Commission on the court minutes of the Cloth Workers' Company of London relating to their estate in Londonderry. Between 2016 and 18, he held an R.J. Hunter postdoctoral research fellowship from the Royal Irish Academy at Queen's, focused on the Ulster Plantation. He has published research pursuant from this postdoc in Analecta Hibernica, Irish Historical Studies, and edited collections with both Manchester University Press and Routledge. Today he will talk to us about estate records for the Ulster Plantation 1609 to 1641.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks to Mary and Tom and the rest of the team just for the invite to speak today. So basically I'm going to look not at maps, because obviously they've been looked at already. So on the basically estate records going beyond the Crown surveys. So the Crown surveys, so just to give a brief overview, are basically the ones that were commissioned specifically by the Crown, almost entirely within the reign of James I, because James I was interested in the great British project that was the Ulster Plantation, whereas his son decided he was not. So the Crown surveys, basically they date from between 1611 up to 1622. So the first of them was undertaken by this chap, Sir George Carew, in 1611, and then they were taken very regularly over the next 11 years, so by Josiah Bodley, who did the maps as well prior to the plantation, so he did a Crown survey in 1613, another in 1614 and another in 1616. The 1614 and the 1616 ones are virtually lost apart from a small excerpt on Londonderry from the 1614 one, but the 1613 is extremely detailed. So then we have George Allen's muster of the province in 1618, Nicholas Pennar in the winter of 1619, and then the biggest one of the lot is the Crown Survey of 1622 as part of the Commission for Irish Affairs. So these are kind of, I suppose, sort of a lot of the standard surveys for how you would actually go about looking at all of the 180 odd estates across the 6 counties. But what I want to look at today is going beyond these Crown surveys to some of the often less examined estate material that exists in various archives and that are on individual estates or on individual regions. So again, as I say, some of these fill in the gap for the reign of Charles I in particular, but they also provide greater colour on some of the estates where the Crown surveys were overly specific. So the Crown surveys wanted to look at things like basically whether or not the individuals who had been granted estates were actually fulfilling the articles of plantation. So were they bringing in British tenants? Were they building, a manor house in Bawn? But they didn't. That meant that they weren't very imaginative in terms of how they looked at various other things. And the Irish are broadly absent from an awful lot of these surveys. It's as though they don't even exist on some of these estates, even though they were still the predominant population across the vast majority of West Ulster. So, what are some of these non-Crown survey estate records? Unfortunately, there is a geographical disparity in terms of how these records have actually survived. They're not even for the 6 counties. If you want to study Londonderry, basically you were in luck. The London Livery Companies were, as we've already kind of seen in terms of a number of papers to do with various maps kept on them and various other records. The London Livery Companies were some of the great record keepers of early modern England and Ireland. So they kept voluminous kind of court minutes of which detailed their business meetings at their meetings about twice a week in their livery halls in London. Now, obviously the vast majority of their business was to do with things like trade or their properties in London, but if you go through these volumes of court minutes, you will find every couple of pages an entry to their Irish estate and how it was being managed. And the vast majority of these court minutes survive either in the Guildhall Library in London or else in the individual livery companies' archives. It varies from company to company. They all have their own idiosyncratic way of doing it, because some of them, they moved over and back. Some of it was to do with the Blitz during the Second World War. So, there's also some disparity within these minutes from the point of view that sometimes it depended on the individual clerk. Some of them kept much more detailed records than others did. Some of them kept a kind of a synopsis of what the meeting was. Some of them copied out entire letters, so that if there was a letter being sent to, say, their tenants in Ireland, or maybe they had representatives as well in Dublin who kind of handled money for them going over to Ireland, sometimes the clerk would literally copy out the entire letter. So, as I say, it varies from company to company. So this is just a typical extract from the court minutes of the Vintners Company. So this is from October 1616, and it is to do with Baptist Jones, who was in charge of kind of managing the estate at this point. I don't call them the farmers of the estates. I think they were still more like chief tenants, because the livery companies were still managing affairs in London. They didn't just farm out the estate and then just divest themselves of any interest. They still managed it from London. So I think some of the depiction of them as farmers that was established by Moody was maybe a little bit overly excessive. Now, when it came to these minutes, as I say, they varied considerably. One of the things that meant that there would be an awful lot of record is if the tenant was a particularly atrocious tenant, because then they had to constantly debate about what they were going to do about this individual. Sometimes they had to bring them over to London and go, well, look, you're 4.5 years behind on any rent, so we would like the money at some point. Other things that came up were, sometimes often quite trivial things in terms of trying to organise supplies of nails, of glass panes, of doors and locks, stuff that you had to send over in order to actually build 8 or 9 houses, or to build a kind of a manor house on your plantation village. So, it might seem like mundane records, but at the same time, if you use them imaginatively, these are very useful for recreating how an actual plantation was built. Again, as I say, it does vary from company to company. So, for most of them, it's the court minutes that you would look at. But for a number of the companies, there were clerks who decided to put together volumes which specifically dealt with the Irish estate. So, specifically for the goldsmiths, the ironmongers, and the cloth workers. So this image comes from a volume that was put together by Henry Carter, who was the clerk of the Goldsmiths Company in the 1610s. This is a very, very large volume. It's like 750 pages of records. It recreates letters, and it also has things like this. So this is a survey that was undertaken in 1614 by Andrew Bowdler and Robert Glenn, who were two surveyors that were appointed by the company after they had received their lands in December 1613. The plantation had been established for 3.5 years at that point, but the distribution of the 12 estates to the livery companies was done by lottery in London in December 1613. So there's this flurry of activity into 1614 as they all tried to figure out, well, what is it that we actually now own? And this was kind of a product of how they figured that out. Now, I suppose one of the benefits of this particular example is that it proves the fact that this is a lengthy survey. It goes on for, I think it's about 8 or 9 pages overall. And one of the things it reveals is that there were already British tenants on this particular estate. So it wasn't as though they were coming into their estates in Londonderry and having to plant them fresh from the beginning. Basically, the natural order of there being good land on the Goldsmiths estate meant that there was British settlers already after drifting here by the end of 1613 into 1614. That's to a certain extent because the Goldsmiths estate was right next to the town of Derry, so people wanted to live there. It would have been very different if you'd have gone down into the Drapers and the Skinners' lands down in Loching Sholan, where mountainous territory that was very heavily forested. So that is one of the examples of these 3 volumes. The other one that I'll look at here very briefly is the Ironmonger's Book of Estate Records. Ironically enough, put together by a chap called R. Hunter, which has actually led once or twice when I've submitted something to somebody, to an editor coming back and going, oh, you need to reference it as R.J. Hunter. And it's like, no, it's not. So R. Hunter put this together, and it's about 200 folios, a mix of documents. Some of it actually has, I think there's 2 maps in there. And again, it just covers letters, various estate records, but all to do with Ireland. Not just extracts from court minutes, an actual clerk in London saying that it was important to put together a full volume of Irish records. So one of the things, this sheds an awful lot of light in terms of, again, the things that are missed in the Crown surveys, they actually give some colour to things. So, for instance, it was on the Ironmonger's estate that an awful lot from this volume that a lot of the records about the conspiracy against the plantation in 1615, that a lot of those records actually come from. So, this threat that various members of the local Irish families were going to try and attack the plantation in 1615. Which was detailed extensively in the late Ray Gillespie's book, Conspiracy, Ulster Plots and Plotters. So that's the Ironmonger's volume. Then there are other ones that are very much random sort of survivals. So this is a page from a rental in the Guildhall Library. So it relates to the Mercer's estate between 1628 and 1631. Now why this is particularly valuable is just the late date of it. Most of the livery company records, they're very extensive for the 1610s and for much of the 1620s. But then they just kind of drop off of a cliff after around 1625, 1626, because of course Charles I was starting to look into taking over their lands from them, and they became disinterested really in trying to develop them, because why would you invest time and energy into developing estates that were going to be confiscated by the Crown? So this one is kind of late for 1628 and 1631. And what's also interesting about it is that it involves a specific breakdown in terms of the distribution of money to the cooks, the masons, and the broderers. So one of the things that kind of gets overlooked a lot within the studies of the Londonderry Plantation is that there were dozens of companies involved. So when we talk about the kind of the 12 estates, these were the 12 great livery companies at the time, but there were 55 companies originally. Not all of them got involved, but nearly all of the companies had a number of sub-companies that were involved with them in their particular plantation, and depending on how much money they had contributed, they did have a little bit of a say in terms of what happened. Some of them sold out to the main livery company over time, but as this one indicates, the cooks and the masons and the broderers still had a say in what was happening on the mercers' lands as late as 1628. Okay, so that's broadly some of the material on Londonderry. I could go on about that because there is just so much material that just hasn't been properly looked at in the livery company records, and some of it is there's an awful lot more material more research to be done on that. And some of it is upstairs. In fact, upstairs has a number of documents that are actually no longer in London because they were copied out in the 1930s, and the originals were destroyed during the Blitz. So upstairs actually has the surviving copies. So, in terms of the other 5 counties, as I say, it is much, much more hit and miss in terms of what's actually available and what isn't. Quite simply, for some proportions across Armagh, Cavan, Fermanagh, Donegal, Tyrone, there is hardly any material other than the Crown surveys. But there are either individual proportions or individual precincts that there is a much, much greater amount of material and really interesting material. So this particular image, which obviously doesn't come across great there on the thing that I took that on a very poor camera about 10 years ago. But this is from the Lane manuscripts in Edinburgh University Library. And there's a photostat copy of these upstairs. It's T544, which this is taken from. But these records relate to the proportions of Killeen and Eden in the barony of Strabane between 1613 and 1618. Now what's really useful about these is that they're a mix of kind of rentals and also just incidental disbursements, various administrative records. You could call them kind of a miscellany of administrative records relating to these 2 proportions over this 5-6 year period. And what they reveal is that, if you were to look at Bodley or Nicholas Pinnar at the beginning and end of that period, you'd see very little development on these 2 proportions. You'd have a little bit of a record of the building work that had been done, and there was a couple of British tenants, but you don't see much beyond that. But when you look at the Hamilton records, what you see is that the Irish are still basically in charge of the plantation. They're doing everything. They're building the houses. They're administering the estate pretty much. So Patrick Groom O'Devon is basically the middleman who's running everything there. And on top of that, you even have things like somebody being paid to take a letter to Dublin on behalf of the Hamiltons and then returning with a horse that one of the Hamiltons had asked him to buy. So you get an awful lot more kind of colour of what's actually going on beyond what's in the Crown surveys. So if we had more records like this for a lot of the other estates in the other 5 counties, I suspect we would have an awful lot more colour about what's going on there too. But unfortunately it is very hit or miss. There are others. I'm not going to dwell on it because it was basically these records were covered in such detail by Hunter in his dissertation and in his articles. So if you take our man Cavan, you have stuff in the National Library like the Farnham papers, the Fingal papers and the Roulston papers, which again provide quite a bit of information on the estates there. I'm sure one that many of you will be familiar with are the Balfour rentals for Fermanagh in 1632, 1636, one of which is actually on display upstairs today. And then there are the Hastings manuscripts in the Huntington Library, which deal with the lands that were originally granted to the Irish Attorney General, John Davies, who had an outsized role in actually planning the plantation. And again, they come from a later date. So a lot of those are from kind of the late 1620s and in particular the 1630s. So again, they are particularly useful for filling that gap where there just aren't any Crown surveys in the 1630s. Cool. Then there are kind of the records that are smaller in size, but maybe a little bit more obscure and less known about, but that they also have a particular value. So this particular document, sorry, that's the Balfour rentals. This document comes from Buckinghamshire Records Office. So it is to do with the sale of the Tonaforus and Dromore and Lorga proportions in the precinct of Lifford in Donegal in 1637. Now, there are articles of agreement around selling this particular estate, which normally in articles of agreement would just be a legal document. It might have the value of the sale and the lands involved, but it wouldn't have a huge amount of information. What was particularly useful in this particular instance is that they appended a full list of the tenants, so dozens of individuals that were still living on this proportion in 1637, and as you will not be surprised to hear, there was still predominantly Irish tenants, so it was becoming more of a kind of a mix. That's a pretty obscure record from a local record office in England. I suspect that there are more that we don't know about. A lot of them are referenced in David Edwards and Brian Donovan's British Sources for Irish History, but inevitably Dave and Brian were compiling their catalogue, what would it be, 35 years ago. So there could be other records that have since been catalogued properly and that are now, that it's apparent that they are in those archives. So, that is in terms of these kind of smaller records. I was going to say something about the Inquisitions of Ulster. I'll skip through it pretty quickly because I'm conscious of time. These were compiled in the 19th century. They are used extensively in the historiography, but I think that they're still underutilised for the very simple reason that they combine so much Latin and English at the same time that I think that there's a modern kind of a reluctance to use some of them. And embedded an awful lot of the time in these inquisitions are actually the names of tenants and of lands and of various little bits of disputes that were occurring on particular estates. Looking beyond West Ulster, and these are kind of incidental things. I don't want to deal too much on East Ulster because I'm kind of sticking to the 6 officially counted counties. But in terms of how we kind of tend to look at it in terms of the official plantation in the west, and then there's the unofficial plantation in the east, and that there's kind of, almost as though they obey county boundaries that are there today. But the records often, they go over and back between each other. So an awful lot of the London livery records, for instance, do actually contain material that is relevant to Antrim. So you'll get, references to the Earl of Antrim, who was providing credit an awful lot of time to the livery companies because it was easier to have MacDonald provide money or resources, and then the companies could repay him later on, rather than them trying to send over money and resources. Then there are other records in terms of Charles Monk's survey of the ports of Ulster, taken in 1637. A very detailed record in terms of the kind of administration of the ports and the kind of things that were coming in. So it kind of, I suppose, supplements the port books from 1612 to 1615, but in terms of what was happening a quarter of a century later. So it deals with things to do with smuggling, what the interconnections were between these officials, what they were being paid. And again, if you use these, they might seem like kind of drab or sources to a certain extent, but when you actually dig down into them, if they're used imaginatively, they can reveal quite an awful lot about what is going on in Ulster at that time. So sometimes there are the kind of accidental discoveries. So Richard Boyle tried to basically buy the entire precinct of Boylock and Banna in 1630, 1631. Now most people wouldn't think to look at the estate records of the first Earl of Cork when they're going studying the Ulster Plantation. But in one of these letter books that is in Chatsworth House, you do find the fact that he tried to purchase an enormous chunk of Donegal at this time from John Murray, the Earl of Annandale. So again, this kind of points towards the very fact that there can be an awful lot of records that are not found in immediately obvious places in order to study the plantation. I'll leave it there.
Well, good afternoon again, folks. Great to be with you. And I'm going to be talking about something that was, in fact, quite close to Bob's own heart. He was very interested in the study of material culture, and he was particularly interested in gravestones and funeral monuments as a way of understanding changes that were occurring as a result of the processes associated with the plantation. He was well known as someone who could be found in many graveyards across the north of Ireland. There's a story told by John Morrill in his introduction to Bob's collected essays that one day Bob and one of his collaborators planned to go out to an old graveyard in Donegal to look for a particular headstone or ledger stone. And unfortunately they sat in Bob's house drinking tea for quite a long time. So by the time they set off for Donegal, it was getting dark, and by the time they reached the graveyard, it was even darker. Now, the sight of a couple of men going into an old graveyard in the dusk with spades and shovels did excite some local interest. Morrill relates how a crowd gathered that was suspicious, maybe even a little hostile. But the tension was broken when somebody in the crowd shouted out, "Hey, that's Bob Hunter, he taught me!" And the suspicion evaporated, and then it was one of friendly cooperation. Now, what we find in the plantation period, it's not the beginning of stone monuments with inscriptions. There were certainly in the northwest, and my talk is particularly focused on the northwest, there were certainly medieval grave slabs. You can find them in a number of places in graveyards around Donegal. There's a famous one at Clonca graveyard in Inishowen, to a Magnus McCorriston that shows a sword and a cross and a stick with a little ball, a hurling stick, probably a shinty stick, with a ball. So there were certainly inscribed stones from the medieval period, but it is with the plantation that we begin to see many more of these memorials, tombstones with inscriptions, and inscriptions in English and displaying various forms of symbolism. So let me take an example. This is one of the earliest. It's in a location that it's almost impossible to get a good photograph of it, so a friend of mine sketched it out. But you can see, first of all, the inscription runs around the edge of the stone. So the inscription is marginal to the stone. Here is the burial place of John McGee, who deceased the 26th of February 1617, and his family. So marking out the burial place of John McGee and his family. And this was a way in which the incoming settler community were able to put down roots, not simply in establishing their farms and homesteads, but in establishing places of burial that were marked out as being their own. You'll notice as well the coat of arms. Those are, well, I now know those are actually supposed to be leopards' heads. That's the McGee coat of arms. You see the hand clasping a sword, and above that, a Celtic cross. Now, these McGees are very interesting. They came across from Dumfries in the south of Scotland. They were a Catholic family who established a base and were actually very much involved with the Hamiltons. The Hamilton landlords in Strabane Barney included quite a few Catholics among their number. I will come back to that at the end of this presentation. Again, another example of a very early stone. Now, in this case, unfortunately, the surname is illegible. It's just gone. But you can see it's built. It's now on its side. It's built into a low retaining wall at Taboyne Churchyard near St Johnston in Donegal. Again, the inscription runs along here. We've got John, but surname gone. It's from 1626. But it does tell us that John, whoever he was a cloth worker. So his occupation is recorded on the stone. And we do know from plantation records that in this area there were tuck mills, woolen mills. So part of the plantation economy, woolen mills were in operation in this area. And maybe this John, whoever he was employed or worked or ran or managed one of these tuck mills. So it's interesting again that we're not dealing with monuments to the elites in society, the landowning classes. I mean, a cloth worker. We have a tombstone to a cloth worker who died in 1626 in this graveyard in Donegal. A Grange graveyard. We have headstone or a tombstone to a Robert Granger. It's just coincidence that Granger should be buried in Grange graveyard, of all places. And this is one of the stones. Bob, in his essay in Tyrone History and Society, explored some of the very earliest tombstones in County Tyrone. And he pays attention to this one, and even in the slightest details, Bob could bring out so much. So again, we know that Robert Granger was one of the early Scots to settle in this area. He's recorded in the 1622 certificate as part of the plantation survey. We even know the townland he lived in because of the Suminister rolls that have survived and which are part of the database. Again, the coat of arms. So again, signifying a certain status. 3 stags' heads. Again, note inscription around the edge of the stone. 1630. Okay, Robert Granger died in 1630. It begins here lieth, and even the spelling of here, it's H-E-I-R. And Bob notes, well, that's hints of the Lowland Scots. Of course, they were coming in from Lowland Scotland predominantly to this area, predominantly from Renfrewshire and Lanarkshire, this part of County Tyrone. So memorials like this, again, they can help us to connect with the period, but they also reveal something of the character, the outlook, the priorities, you could say, of the families coming in and their importance the importance they attached to places of burial. Now, we also find memorials in churches of varying sophistication. So this is one in Raphoe Cathedral. It's really a large, rough slab on which there is an inscription. You know, it's in uppercase, Roman capitals. It's in Latin. The other ones I showed you were in English, but this is in Latin. Maybe not surprisingly, this is to the wife of a clergyman, Archibald Adair, Dean of Raphoe. And it's to his wife, Ginetta. He gives her maiden name, Houston, and records that although she died at the age of only 20, she had already given birth to twins twice. Only one of each pairing of twins had actually survived. But it says a curious stone. There's nothing particularly sophisticated about it. It's quite crude in a way in terms of its execution. But nonetheless, packed into the inscription, there's so much information about this particular family, and it extols the virtues of Janetta, the wife of Archibald Adair. Much more sophisticated is the Hansard Monument in Clonlee Parish Church in Lifford, not very far away from Raphoe, in County Donegal. This is a monument to Sir Richard Hansard and his wife, Diamond. Now, you can see two figures kneeling, dressed in contemporary costume, kneeling over against a prayer stool, and the inscription behind it. And again, the inscription goes into such detail about Sir Richard Hansard. He died in 1619, October 1619. His wife died just a couple of days later, in 1619. The inscription tells us quite a bit about Hansard. It records how he was born in Lincolnshire. He was a Master of Arts at Cambridge. He was in the Elizabethan army in Ireland. He was granted the fort of Lifford after the 9 Years' War, which ended in 1603. How he was given a patent to develop Lifford as a town in the plantation. How in his will he left money to found a church and a school and to employ a schoolmaster. And it names the executors to his will and how they had fulfilled the conditions in that will. Although it's a monument to Sir Richard very obviously, it's also a monument to the executors and the exactness with which they had carried out the instructions in his will. If you look very closely at it, you'll see where the noses have been sliced off. There's a story that during the Williamite War, Jacobite soldiers came into the church and sliced off the noses of the figures, which were then subsequently replaced. In the mid-19th century, it was actually painted completely black. But whenever they began to take the paint off, they discovered that the original colours were preserved underneath. Now, in this case, we don't quite know who was responsible for the monument. Amy Harris, who's here today, Dr. Amy Harris completed a thesis on monuments, church monuments in Ireland, 1560 to 1660. So we can have a word of her about that. But it's likely that it was imported rather than being executed by a local craftsman. I think, don't really know for sure. It's not quite as grand as the Chichester Monument in Carrickfergus. It's not really grand at all compared to that. But it is, as one historian described, a more homely affair in terms of funeral sculpture. Now you can find other monuments. I'm stepping outside Ulster here, but I show this because this is the freestanding monument at Ardbracken to George Montgomery, who in 1605 was appointed Bishop of Derry, Raphoe and Clogher, and who played such a formative role in ensuring that the new church, the new Reformed church, was in such a sound landed base. That was really his main aim, to secure a significant landed endowment for the church. He, after he gave up Derry and Raphoe, he kept Clogher for a while, but he was appointed Bishop of Meath, and his monument is here at Ardbracken in Meath. And it is a remarkable structure for its time. You can see again the effigial figures carved into it. You also find examples of that, again, not very far from here at Bangor, the Bradshaw stone in Bangor Abbey in County Down. And you can see the way the inscription in false relief, again, some of it runs around the edge of the stone. Notice the memento mori, remember you must die, the skull, the crossed bones. And then these three figures. Again, look at the detail there. TB, Thomas Bradshaw, and we think his wife and daughter. So you notice the detail, the ruff around the neck and so on. It's really quite an amazing memorial. It's inside the church now. And then one wonders, was it always inside the church? Or had it been brought in from the churchyard at some point? Now, not all monuments survive. Many were destroyed. Many we know were lost in the 1641 uprising. This is all that remains of a memorial to the wife of Sir James Montgomery, She was a Stuart, Catherine Stuart, the daughter of Sir William Stuart, who gave his name to Newton Stuart, and it's in the church in Newton Stuart. But it's all that's left of a much larger and grander monument was destroyed in 1641. Towards the end of the 17th century, he was William Montgomery of Rosemount, the famous author of the Montgomery manuscripts, wrote that it was curious and sumptuous, of divers colours, all polished marble, inscribed with mottos and verses of his, that is, her husband's own composure, and gilded in every fit place. So William had a memory of his mother's monuments here at Newton Stuart. Sadly, that's all that remains of it today. Now, you can find in some cases tools associated with the deceased represented on the tombstones. I've mentioned the clothwork. I'll name some of the clothwork. Well, here we have William Stenners. This again is in Bangor Abbey. William Stenners, here down the body, William Stenners, Master Mason. Okay, M.R. Mason, Master Mason. And you can see on it, shield, and then the tools of the grave, or not the grave, the mason carved on it. So linking his occupation with representations of the tools he used in the course of his work. And one wonders, for example, was William Stenners the man responsible for restoring Bangor Abbey Church in the early 17th century, or even building the new manor house for Sir James Hamilton at Bangor, which is shown on the Raven maps of 1625-26 that Annalee has referred to already. Let's move back. Now, I've shown skulls and crossbones and so on already. This is a period in which mortality symbols are appearing on many of the headstones. Symbols associated with death. I mean, there was a preoccupation with death. Not surprising in an era where so many people died young, where there's so much infant mortality, that this should be a central preoccupation. Memento mori, remember you must die. And we see different representations of mortality symbols and stones. So this is the Pockridge stone. This is in Enniskillen, inside St. McCartan's Cathedral. Again, the inscription runs like this, and then it goes around the stone. The verse on this is actually taken from the statement made by Thomas Cromwell just before his execution in 1540. But we have a representation of the skull. Now, we do see varying depictions of skulls or death's head. You can sort of make an assessment of the anatomical soundness, shall we say, of the skulls. So, in this case, the skull it's got a great big grin on its face and it's staring back at you with these big wide open eyes. So, we do see a considerable variation in how accurately, in an anatomical sense, the skulls and the bones have been created. We see it here too. This is a desert crate in County Tyrone. Here we have the skull, but it's carved as this one we're looking down directly on it from above. The bones are carved here, but they're quite faint. And in fact, they are interrupted by the inscription. In this case, this is the inscription to one of the most interesting people who lived in early 17th century Ulster. It's to Alexander Sanderson. And the inscription, again, some of it's in Latin, some of it's in English, but it tells us he was a foot soldier in Belgium. He was a cavalry officer in Poland. He then came to Ireland, where he was High Sheriff and Justice of the Peace. So in fact, we know that Alexander Sanderson, Captain Alexander Sanderson, was, like many, many Scots in the early 17th century, someone who went to Europe to fight during the 9 Years' War. We can pick him up in records fighting or involved or stationed in Eastern Europe, in Russia, Scandinavia, in the service of, say, Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, or whoever it might be. So he's someone who had experience in the east of Europe, returns to Scotland, and then sets his sight towards Ulster. And he acquires a plantation grant in East County Tyrone. So he's not one of the original undertakers in the plantation scheme, but he's part of that wave of newcomers who come in within 10 years of the plantation and establish themselves and set themselves up in Ulster, acquiring lands from others who had given up or sold or surrendered their lands. The symbols of death are not exclusively found on stones to the Scots or even to the English for that matter. This is a very interesting stone. This is from Carndona in North Donegal and Inishowen, north of Inishowen. This is a Doherty stone. It's from 1636. You think maybe 1686, but I think maybe 1636. It's quite faint. You need to get the sun at the right angle. I don't know how much better this is, but we see the skull, the crossed bones, the bell, okay, which was rung at funerals. It's another one of the mortality symbols that we frequently find on headstones. And here we have a representation of an hourglass, time running out. So symbols of death, they transcend, you might say, other divisions within the province. So we're finding them on memorials to the English, to the Scots, and to the Irish as well. An ultimate slide. This is the monument to Bishop William Bedell down at Kilmore in County Cavan. Bedell, of course, very well known, and it's been mentioned already. Brendan has edited a recent book on Bedell. It's a flat ledger stone on a raised sort of vault. It's been broken sadly. You can see a metal pin holding it together here. We have the bishop's mitre at the top. We have the coat of arms, very elaborate mantling around it. And down here again, the skull, the crossbones, the hourglass on its side. Sometimes when an hourglass is shown on its side, it represents life that has been cut short suddenly or abruptly. And we know that Bedell died in 1642, in the year after the uprising, and we know he suffered various privations as a result of that. But look here, the columns here, they're capitals. So classicism is also coming into the fore now, and we see it represented on tombstones. Notice here the open book, very appropriate given Bedell's patronage of the translation of the Old Testament into Irish. Now, the memorial has been restored or repaired at different times. The inscription here has certainly been recut since the original, but still it's a remarkable memorial to a remarkable individual. The final one I want to show you is not a gravestone proper. It's an astonishing stone in some ways. It's actually built into a bridge in the village of Artigarvan in County Tyrone, a couple of miles north of Strabane. Sadly, it's in much worse condition now than when this photograph was taken. And Bob was very interested in this particular stone. But you can see the inscription Adi Gloriam Robertus Algio, 2nd of May, 1625. And it displays on it a crucifixion scene. Okay, and you might think, that's a strange stone. Well, first of all, Algio. Who's Algio? As Italian. Well, actually, Algio was a Scot. A very influential Scot. Came from Paisley in Scotland. They had been closely associated with the Hamiltons, the Abercorn Hamiltons in Paisley in Scotland, and they turn up in Strabane Barony as part of the plantation scheme there. And they're very much involved in implementing that scheme. Robert Algio was essentially a land steward or agent to the Hamiltons. And like the Hamilton landlords, the Algios were a prominent Catholic family. In fact, it's recorded that Robert Algio opened his home for the celebration of Mass in the late 1620s. So this is a fascinating stone. Its purpose is not quite clear. Was it intended for a new Catholic place of worship? Was it created because of a misguided sense that somehow something like this could be accommodated in the plantation scheme by the late 1620s? It's very strange. How they end up on the bridge is another mystery. Can't answer that one either. But still, Here we have, in the heart of Plantation, Ulster, a memorial featuring a crucifixion scene, an emblem associated with the Counter-Reformation, turning up on the memorial to a Scotsman who was responsible for helping to implement the plantation scheme in that area. I mean, if anything captures the complexity of this period, that's it. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Dr. Brendan Scott, who is the manager of the Irish Family History Foundation, author and editor of a number of books and essays relating to religion, society, and trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the editor of the Brefna Journal. Two of his forthcoming publications are the Cavan entry in the Irish Historical Towns Atlas series, with the Royal Irish Academy, and an edition of the Returns of the Royal Visitations of the Church of Ireland in 1622, published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission. Brendan is the editor of Society and Administration in Ulster's Plantation Towns, published by Four Courts Press in 2019. And his most recent book is an edited volume of essays, Bishop William Bedell, 1571 to 1642, His Life, Work and Contemporaries, published in 2025. And Brendan's going to speak to us on the subject of the Ulster Plantation Towns.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind invite to speak today. It's been a great day, really enjoyed it. I've learned an awful lot, including from Tom O'Connor the correct pronunciation of prosopography. So that's been very helpful. I don't mind writing the word, but I usually say a list, but I'm quite happy. Prosopography. Great. I would say as well that when I was driving up here today, I drove through 3 incorporated Ulster Plantation towns, Clogher and Enniskillen, and then arrived in Belfast here. And as someone I would just like to mention, whose second anniversary was just a few days ago, was the late Ray Gillespie, a proud Belfast man. And I thought of him when I was driving up today, because if anyone ever visited him in his office in Maynooth, where Tom worked with him for many years, the screensaver on his PC was the Belfast Charter. So he never forgot where he came from, and I just, as I say, it was his anniversary a few days ago, and I just wanted to remember him here. So what I'm going to do is talk about the plantation towns in a very broad way, because in 20-25 minutes, an hour, no. You can only do so much, and but I would point you towards a book that I edited a few years ago about Ulster Plantation towns, not because I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but because of the great articles that were in it. Paddy was in it, William was in it, Anna Lee was in it, and I missed a trick by not getting David Heffernan in it, but he wrote a nice review of it, so it all worked out well. But anyway, if you are interested, there's lots of good stuff in there if you want to learn more about this. So in the establishment, I suppose, of urban settlements as key components in any successful plantation had long been recognised by the English Crown. In the late 16th century, Edmund Spencer, himself a beneficiary of the Munster Plantation, wrote in his view of the state of Ireland that nothing doth sooner cause any civility in any country than many market towns, by reason that people repairing thither for their needs will daily see and learn civil manners. Thomas Blennerhassett at Planter Basin Fermanagh stressed the importance of an urban network of incorporated towns, cities and boroughs in bringing what he believed to be civility to an untamed wild region. Towns in the colonial context, whereas Willie Smith writes, frontier outposts created to dominate and reorganise hitherto hostile territories, and were, in his view, the central instruments of imperial expansion and control. Each plantation town was a manifestation and expression of the strength of colonial power and control, key components in the complex cultural landscape that had emerged as a result of colonialism across Ulster in the early 17th century. Fortifications were constructed, new streets laid out, and marketplaces established. The corporate status of the towns also meant that they contained a suite of administrative and cultural buildings with centralised functions such as churches, schools, markets, session houses and jails, what has been called the visual representation of the fundamental political change in the 6 planted counties.
The Charter for Dungannon, for example, issued in November 1612, prioritised building projects in the town, such as the building of a parish church, a school and a marketplace. It said how many people should be settled there and the amount of land to be granted to them. And the plantation towns, or at least the newly built ones, generally comprise of long, wide, straight streets, maybe with, we've seen this map already, but I mean, if you're, if you go to Derry now, that'll get you around, you know where you're going. But hilariously, I did manage to go the wrong way down a one-way street in Derry one day, which went very well for me. And then of course, then in the centre area there, you have what's called the Diamond area, and the streets would usually converge on the Diamond. There'll be a Church of Ireland church nearby, which I think is up in the top corner up there, and then there'll be a market house and maybe doubling as a sessions house and that kind of thing. Other towns like Armagh and Cavan retained their Gaelic character much more. And didn't follow a lot of those forms, and much more confused. And even if you drive around Armagh today, again, you kind of need to know where you're going because, and Irish style housing and modes of living and agriculture were to be outlawed in these towns and in the hinterland. And the Gaelic Irish were not permitted to live in the towns, but as Dave Heffernan pointed out there, I mean, they often were. Theory and practice are two very different things. I often think it's very easy for Whitehall to say, right, you shall do A, B, and C. But if you're stuck in the middle of Donegal in 1620 and you need tenants, you'll take whoever you can get, really. So that was happening. Now, why are they trying to keep the Gaelic Irish out? Well, partly they want to stop the British settlers from going native. That's always a great fear of any colonial power. And the other was to lead by example, the expectation being that the Gaelic Irish, when faced with this superior form of civility, would see the error of their ways and adopt the British customs and practices. And through this means of cultural osmosis, the Stuart administration, through the activities of their settlers, hoped to transform Irish space into another England. It was also expected that the use of markets and commerce would have the desired effect of civilising the native Irish population, because nothing civilises like money. And it was noted in Dundrum in County Down, which is outside the official plantation. But again, as I think David said, or perhaps Andrew, I mean, the plantation doesn't stop at a county border or county boundary. Oftentimes these guys are buying up lands in neighbouring counties which aren't, like Clonus, which isn't, like that has a diamond. And Castleblaney and Monaghan and all these different places. So it's not just as simple as the plantation stops here at this line. It seeps through. And so in Dundrum in Down, in 1629, it was noted that this notion of markets and commerce would be the means by which the rude and country people of that region may be led to a more humane and civil mode of life. Of course, this being early modern Ireland, the outcome was not as the Stuart administration may have expected or hoped. In Ulster, the decision regarding the location of these new towns was in the hands of the plantation commissioners, who by 1609 had identified 25 locations where corporate towns might be established. Now, some of these changed along the way, and there was some mention of that earlier. Some fell by the wayside, like in Omagh. The plan to incorporate Omagh was abandoned when it was realised that the land surrounding the town had been leased in 1610 to John Lee, who was the constable of the fort there, without any obligation on him to establish an urban settlement. So that was Omagh gone. The fort settlement in Mountjoy, which had been established to support communication across Lough Neagh, was no longer necessary. They didn't need that then, so it wasn't incorporated, so it fell off the list. But in any case, there was 15 towns incorporated between 1610 and 13, with 12 of those in 1613, and then there's a few outliers after that. Killybegs in 1615, Clogher in 1629, and St Johnson around 1630ish, or we're not entirely sure. But there's a map of the towns as they ended up being incorporated. So you can kind of tell the way I drove up to Belfast today along the line there. So, as I say, the ones that are in red are new ones that weren't on the original list, and then there's some of them that have fallen off, like Omagh in the middle there, and a few others as well. Now, some of the town sites to be incorporated were chosen for strategic reasons, like, as I say, when they were talking about Mountjoy, for example, but it fell off. So Belturbet in Cavan was situated on the banks of the Erne at a fording point, a good way to get in and out of South Ulster. So So it was incorporated. Other charters were granted to pre-existing settlements, which were now regularised and brought under the control of the town. And a number of those incorporated towns had existed for centuries prior to the Ulster Plantation, including, as I said a minute ago, Cavan and Armagh. Carrickfergus in Antrim, and again outside the official plantation, they had a corporation certainly by 1375, maybe as early as 1260. By the 16th century, so before it got this new incorporation, Carrickfergus was a flourishing trading port, probably the unofficial capital of Ulster, really. And then there's other towns, as I say, like Ballyshannon, Coleraine, Derry, Carrickfergus, as I say. They're already thriving port towns before they were ever incorporated. Over the following years, these towns developed under the aegis of a diverse range of patrons, as we've seen already, from individual local landlords and corporations to the powerful London companies. Each had differing motivations, ambitions and abilities as urban developers, which accounted for the varied extent and appearance of those plantation towns. As a given example, like Virginia and Belturbet and Cavan, Virginia was very slow to develop and missed out on getting a charter actually because it was slow to develop. And Belturbet was soon the largest town in Cavan, and that was largely down to the dynamism or otherwise of their founders. When the Earl of Abercorn died in 1618, he was complaining 4 years later that Strabane had languished and drooped, so it wasn't moving. Oftentimes it was the personal dynamism of the person pushing it along, and then when they went, then there wasn't that push afterwards. So I kind of want to talk about the municipal government of these towns and these charters, which conferred a wide range of powers on the corporations, which were the governing bodies of these incorporated towns. So the corporations were empowered to dispense law and justice, to hold fairs and markets, with details in the charters usually given regarding the dates for the holding of markets and fairs and that kind of thing. The charter also outlines the initial office holders from the sovereign or the portree, the mayor essentially, down to the burgesses, the freemen, a property minority who held positions on the corporation. And the leader of the corporation goes under different titles. In Ballyshannon and in Donegal he's the portree. In Killybeg, Strabane and Dungannon he's the provost. And in Derry and Carrickfergus he's mayor. And those municipal corporations were also parliamentary constituencies, each permitted to return 2 MPs to Parliament, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The main offices which required appointments, aside from the sovereign, was a vice sovereign, a sergeant of the mace, and a town clerk or recorder, the secretary essentially. The sovereign was normally also constituted a justice of the peace, a coroner and a clerk of the market, which entitled him to levy tolls on the fairs and markets held in the town. All prestigious and profitable posts he usually held to himself. The corporation received the profits from the fairs and markets. Now occasionally private individuals would make donations to the corporation. We saw Richard Hansard, who William showed there a moment ago, and as well as funding churches and all that sort of stuff. He also made financial provision for the corporation in Lifford in his will. The corporations not only had a great deal of economic autonomy, they also held a lot of centralised functions, such as the law courts, which normally took place in a specially built sessions house or the Thulsel, the town hall that would be in the area. And then a logical consequence of those courts was the presence of county jails in many of the corporate towns, and they show up in maps and in various records and minutes and so on, as do stocks as well. Stocks often show up for repairs to stocks, and the guy hired, to make the stocks, and these come up in the minutes in the expenditure place as well. And as I mentioned a minute ago, part of the reason for the incorporation of these towns was the political side of things. In the Parliament, which met in Dublin in 1613, it was proclaimed that for the better encouragement of the new plantations in Ulster, and generally for the drawing of inhabitants into such other places as were weakly peopled or dangerous in respect of their situations, His Majesty thought it meet to erect new corporations which would produce good effects for the strength of the kingdom. The Irish Parliament had, and I should remember as well, a great parliamentary historian who we lost last year as well, Bríd McGrath, who was another fine scholar of towns and parliaments in early modern Ireland. The Irish Parliament had long been viewed by the Old English Catholic majority as a means of protecting itself against the Protestant Reformation and the rise of new English interests in Ireland. So long as they held the majority, there was a certain amount of protection. So each county returned 2 MPs to the House of Commons, along with 37 towns throughout Ireland, but only 2 of which were in Ulster, Carrickfergus and Downpatrick. And it was envisaged, as I said initially, that 25 Ulster towns would be incorporated, with the notion was exclusively Protestant membership. And so it's obvious that James I and the Dublin government were hoping to pack any new parliament with their own supporters, which is exactly what happened in that parliament from 1613 to 15. And so it was that the Catholic faction lost control of the Irish parliament. But the extirpation of Catholicism, one of the pillars on which the Ulster Plantation was built, in theory, did not always run smoothly, even from the inside. And again, William, and I think David has mentioned this, George Hamilton, the brother of the first Earl of Abercorn, who planted Strabane, was a Catholic. The family used their residences for religious services and so on. And much to the annoyance of Bishop George Downham of Derry, who accused Hamilton of planting popery there. And despite examples like Hamilton and the work of David Edwards, who wrote a lovely essay about a haven of popery, about British people, British Catholics moving to Ireland to get away from English scrutiny, the Reformation hadn't really impacted on Ulster before the early 17th century. And when parish churches came to be built on new estates, they were frequently constructed not on the traditional medieval sites that were inconvenient for the new settlement pattern, but rather in the newly established town where it was thought settlers would congregate. And here in Belfast, Arthur Chichester built a parish church for his new town, not on the traditional site at Shankill, but on the site of a medieval chapel at the ford across the Lagan, because it was more convenient for his new settlers. This was a common development in the Ulster Plantation. In the Conwall parish in Raphoe in 1622, it was noted that as the old parish church was now ruinated and decayed, being situated before in a remote waste place, it would be fitting to be transported to a market town called Letterkenny, where there is 80 families of British inhabitants within the midst of the parish. A similar example can be found in Belturbet and Cavan, which was in the parish of Anna. The commissioners reported in 1622 that although a Protestant cleric was living in the town, there was as yet no new church built, with Anna's pre-Reformation medieval parish church about 3-4 miles outside the town. So it was recommended by the commission in 1622 that as there were a great store of Protestants in and about the town, there should be a church built there. Thomas Moyne, who was the Church of Ireland Bishop of Kilmore, agreed with this recommendation, reporting in 1622 that the church is ruinous and unfit to be repaired by reason of the remoteness from Belturbet. A corporation newly erected is a place fit for a church to be built de novo. And you can find numerous examples of that across the province at this time. And I want to talk about the markets. I mean, incorporation generally went hand in hand with the granting of a market, which was such an important source of revenue for the town's corporation. And in many of the minutes which survived for the corporations at this time, the charges to be imposed upon sales at market and upon the traders themselves are noted, which gives an indication of the goods and the type of merchants operating in the towns during this period. Extra fees were charged if a trader erected a stall rather than sold their goods on the ground, which probably applied to visiting traders who would, there were traders who would just travel the island, going from market to market, fair to fair, and selling the wares wherever they went. But some towns also saw the development or repurposing of more permanent buildings as shops to handle burgeoning trade there. Belfast's economy seemed to have been wealthy enough that by 1639 permanent structures were in situ at the marketplace rather than temporary stalls put up on the day of the market or the fair and then broken down again at the end of the day. And the fixed nature of those buildings, I think, indicates a confidence in the viability of the market and long-term plans of the settler community to remain where they were. Of course, 1639, 2 years later, comes 1641, so the best laid plans. The substantial income accruing from these markets and fairs meant that the rights attached to them were guarded jealously by town corporations. Coleraines Corporation, for example, authorised in 1650 an official to investigate whether other markets were operating within 7 miles of Coleraine, and if there were, the corporation decreed that such course may be taken for vindication of the franchises and privileges of this corporation as shall be fitting. Likewise, it was written into Derry's charter that no other market could be held within 7 miles of the city, as such competition might attract traders and customers alike away from their town and as far as the markets. And that was so jealously guarded because that was such an income spinner for the corporations. And there's also an element of town planning in these new towns, which can be seen in the separate areas which were developed in some towns for the buying and selling of animals, aside from the market square or the diamond. One example being what's called the cow market here in Belturbet in 1723, a few years later. But so this is the main street. I grew up just about in that house there, that one right there. And so this is what's now the Fair Green, was called the cow market. And then the actual diamond is there, the Church of Ireland church there, and then the town hall, the market house is called there, and the diamond just there. And again, you bring the cattle up around the back of the town because you don't want, the inevitable thing that happens when you have lots of livestock around. So it keeps the town a bit cleaner. And Belfast in 1639 attempted to control this issue as well by fining any traders who didn't keep their livestock in the pens provided. So they had pens there to go. And in fact, in the house I grew up in, which backed onto the thing there was a garage at the back of the house, and there was these huge chains, like massive, like a thing where you would tie your animals to. Like the fair ended there, I think, in the 60s, but the chains and the large things were there that you could still tie your animals to. So I'm assuming whoever lived there before we lost a money spinner there, unfortunately. What can you do? So like there were poor towns like Carrickfergus, whose market was held on what was described as a handsome large street, and they often, but not always, developed their markets close to quays. Coleraine Saturday Market was initially held outside the town before being moved within. And here's now this is the OS map for Donegal town. But again, if you look, like this is the diamond, and this is the area where you'd have the market. It opens up wide. The market house is right beside it. You're right beside the water here as well. And so the session house is there, a fish market. So everything kind of centralised in that sort of an area. And as I say, this is the widest part of the town. So you can get people in, you can get stalls in, and you can get selling whatever it is you need. But some of these areas weren't developed as well as it could be. And Derry's market area, immediately following the plantation, lacked the necessary storage facilities or even weights, even though the quay there was reckoned to be the largest in Ireland. While in Coleraine, the custom house was situated in the middle of the town, well away from the quay, and was described as being little bigger than a cobbler's shop, which was plainly an unsatisfactory situation for everyone involved. David here did a lovely article in Analecta a few years ago where you were able to get a great description of these towns around this time. And like an indication of the popularity and necessity of the markets can be seen in a comment given by a deponent in the 1641 depositions. And this observer remarked that Moneymore in County Londonderry was as full of Irish in the early days of the 1641 Rising as if it had been a market day. So obviously the Irish are coming in on those days. And just then to segue into the Gaelic Irish in the towns, as David here said already, I mean, they didn't really go away. They were still there. And there's a document entitled The Discourse for Reformation of Ulster by Colonies, which dates from 1598, pondering the failure of the Laois and Offaly plantations in the 1550s, and it pointed towards the letting of lands out to the native Irish as a main reason for the scheme's ultimate failure there. Only English tenants should be allowed in any future plantation of Ulster, it concluded. Yet, when the time for plantation came, just over a decade later, this advice and the hard-learned experience of previous plantation efforts fell on deaf ears. There was not always a huge effort made to remove the native Irish tenants from the towns and lands given over to the plantation. Landlords acclimatising themselves to the difficulties of attracting sufficient British planters were only too glad at times to accept the Irish on these lands. And so serious a problem was this that royal proclamations were issued every year between 1616 and 19, ordering Irish inhabitants to vacate the plantation towns, and fines were introduced in 1619 for native Irish tenants. But these fines were no deterrent, and as the undertakers found that the native Irish were willing, however reluctantly, to pay a higher rent. And again, back to Belturbet, in 1622 it was reported that there are many Irish dwelling upon it, and the British complain thereof generally that they can get no reasonable bargains till the Irish be removed. So the Irish are willing to pay a higher rent, and the English can't get a good deal because the Irish are paying a higher rent, which was generally a terrible deal for the Irish. It's normally a shorter lease on a higher rent. And that's okay when things are going good. But then when things go bad, as things do in the 1630s, there's a series of harvest failures and different things, a recession, suddenly you're not able to pay that high rent anymore, and that becomes a real problem then in 1641. And despite the orders that each plantation town was to be filled with English-style structures, it was reported in 1622 that Gaelic Irish house forms outnumbered the Irish style 122 to 94 in the London Company villages in County Londonderry. Part of the reason for this was the failure of the planters to provide English-style housing. By 1622, of 20 individuals who had undertaken to build an Armagh, only 7 had actually done so. And unlike many of the towns that were granted a charter, Cavan Town retained much of its Gaelic character in the terms of the makeup of its corporation. There's lots of Irish names, Brady's and different things in that first charter. Cavan wasn't alone in that. In Oher, in 1613, in this charter, there's an O'Reilly, must have snuck up from Cavan. He's one of the burgesses there. And although Armagh was redeveloped along standard plantation lines following its incorporation, it also held on to a large Gaelic population in the immediate years following. And some towns did make an effort to rid themselves of the Irish. The 1611 survey of Lifford mentioned that it was well furnished with inhabitants of English, Scottish and Irish, whereas by 1622 it was noted that its 54 houses were inhabited for the most part with English, so the Irish seemed to be mostly gone. And the same was the case in Donegal town. They had 30 houses rather than 54, but again there had been Irish there in 1611. By 1622 not much sign of them. An order was given to the planters in Derry which stated that they shouldn't take on Irish apprentices but rather source underprivileged children from England for this purpose rather than bringing in Irish ones. And there's cartographic evidence as well depicting Irish-style vernacular buildings inside towns. There's this map of Carrickfergus, a lovely map I'm sure a lot of you know, from 1560, and you can see these kind of Irish-style dwellings. Now, as Dave mentioned earlier on, that's not necessarily indicative that there are Irish people living in them. It's indicative of the people that had available to build houses for them. So it's not necessarily the same thing. But it does give you some idea. And the same with Armagh. This is a map we saw earlier on. Again, up here, these sort of more Irishy vernacular style housing. And so for example, in Ballyshannon in 1622, there were 30 houses built in the Irish style, but they were inhabited mostly by English soldiers, with a few Irish, but mostly English soldiers living in the Irish style house. And just to conclude, despite all of these setbacks and difficulties, I think it must be argued, I think, that the system of corporate towns in the Ulster Plantation was ultimately successful. And the greatest argument in support of the success of the plantation and these towns is the fact that they're still there. And that many of them, up until fairly recently, continued to hold corporate style structures with town councils in the Republic and up here up until the 70s as well. And the towns, especially the town centres, are still laid out, I think, in much the same way as they had been 400 years ago. As I chose the Derry one, but you could really choose an awful lot of plantation towns, particularly in the centre of the towns, and say, where is the church? The buildings may have changed, but the streetscapes are generally in the same layout. And so I think the people who lived there when these towns were first granted corporation status 400 odd years ago will still recognise the streetscapes, I think, as many of them lie today. And the fact that these towns have retained much of their physical, corporate and cultural identities, I think, is testament to the success of the ventures begun there just over 400 years ago. Thank you very much.